Hello, and welcome back to NightSleepWhisper. I'm so glad you're here to spend the night with me. Tonight, we are embarking on a long journey, a 50-chapter mystery set in the misty shores of Blackwood Bay. Find your most comfortable position, let your shoulders relax, and take a deep breath. You don't have to stay awake until the end. My voice will be here to guide you, but it's perfectly okay to let go whenever you're ready. Now, let's step into the mist of Blackwood Bay. Julian stood in front of his new home. It was a small, white house with a blue door. The house sat on a high hill above the ocean. From the front porch, Julian could see the entire bay. The water was a deep, dark blue. The sun was bright, but the wind from the sea was cold. Julian was 35 years old. He was a writer of mystery books. For many years, he lived in a big, noisy city. He worked in a small office with no windows. He was tired of the traffic and the bright lights. He wanted a quiet place to think and write. Blackwood Bay seemed like the perfect town for him. It was a small village with only one road and a few shops. He took a deep breath of the salty air. He felt happy. He opened the blue door and stepped inside. The house was very quiet. It smelled like old wood and dried flowers. There was a small living room with a fireplace. Next to the window, there was a heavy wooden desk. Julian smiled. This was where he would write his next book. He went back to his car to get his boxes. The boxes were heavy because they were full of books and notebooks. He carried them into the house one by one. He put his favorite books on the shelves. He put his pens and his computer on the desk. He looked out the window again. The sun was starting to go down. The sky was turning orange and purple. Julian walked to the kitchen. He made a cup of hot tea. He sat by the window and watched the waves. The ocean was beautiful, but it was also very powerful. He saw a few birds flying over the water. Far away, he saw a small boat. It was moving slowly toward the harbor. Suddenly, the air changed. A thin, white mist started to rise from the water. It moved quickly across the sand. In a few minutes, the beach disappeared. Then, the road disappeared. The white mist was thick and cold. It felt different from normal clouds. It felt heavy. Julian stood up and closed the window. He felt a little bit nervous, but he did not know why. He told himself it was just the weather. Coastal towns often had fog. He turned on the lamp on his desk. The light was yellow and warm. He sat down and opened his notebook. He wrote the first sentence of his new story, but he kept looking at the window. Outside, the world was gone. There was only the white fog and the sound of the ocean against the rocks. A low, deep noise came from the water. It was the sound of a distant bell on a boat. Julian stayed awake for a long time. He felt like the town of Blackwood Bay had a secret. He was a mystery writer, and he was very curious. He wanted to know what was hidden behind the fog. The next morning, the sun was bright. Julian woke up early and looked out the window. The thick, white fog from the night before was gone. The sky was a clear, light blue. He felt much better than he did last night. He put on a warm sweater, his brown boots, and a light jacket. He wanted to explore the neighborhood and see the ocean in the daylight. Julian walked out of his blue front door. The air was fresh and cool. He smelled the green grass and the salt from the sea. The road was very quiet. There were no cars and no people on the street. It was exactly the kind of peace he wanted for his writing. He walked down the hill toward the other houses in the village. Next to his house, there was a garden full of beautiful, colorful flowers. There were red roses, yellow daisies, and purple lavender. Julian saw a woman in the garden. She was wearing a large straw hat and bright green gloves. She was busy digging in the dark soil with a small metal shovel. She looked very focused on her work. "Good morning," Julian said with a friendly smile. The woman looked up. She had short white hair and many kind wrinkles around her eyes. She looked like she was about 70 years old. She stood up slowly and brushed the dirt off her clothes. "Hello there," she replied. She had a soft, steady voice. "You must be the new writer in the White House. The one from the big city." Julian was surprised. He had only been in town for one day. "How do you know that?" he asked. The woman laughed gently. "This is Blackwood Bay, Julian. It is a very small town. Everyone knows when someone new arrives. My name is Martha. I have lived in the house next door for 40 years. Julian walked closer to the wooden fence. "It is nice to meet you, Martha. Your garden is beautiful. You must work very hard on it." Martha looked at her roses and nodded. "Thank you. I love my plants. They need a lot of care and attention. They like the sea air, but they do not like the heavy fog we had last night. It was a very cold mist." Julian remembered the strange feeling from the night before. The fog was very thick. He said, "I could not see the road at all." Martha stopped smiling for a moment. She turned her head and looked at the dark blue ocean. Her face became very serious. "The fog in Blackwood Bay is always strange, Julian. It is not like normal weather. It comes and goes when it wants. Some people say it hides things." Julian did not know what to say to that. He looked at Martha's house. It was a large, old building with many windows. On the top floor, one window was wide open. A white curtain moved slowly in the wind. "I should continue my walk now," Julian said. "It was very nice to meet you, Martha. Enjoy the sun while it is here," Martha said. She went back to her flowers. Julian walked down toward the beach. He heard the waves hitting the large rocks. It was a steady, rhythmic sound that filled the air. He looked back at Martha, but she was already digging in the dirt again. He felt like he was being watched, but the street was empty. He continued his walk, thinking about Martha's words. The sun began to set over the dark water of the bay. The sky was now a deep shade of orange. Julian finished his walk on the beach and started the long climb back up the hill. His legs felt tired, but the fresh air made him feel alert. He thought about his conversation with Martha. She was a kind woman, but she seemed worried about the fog. As Julian reached the top of the hill, he looked at Martha's house. It was a very large, old building made of grey stone. Usually, the house looked warm and friendly, but now, it looked different. All the lights were off. The windows were dark and empty. It looked like a house where no one lived. Julian stopped at the wooden gate of her garden. He looked for Martha, but she was not there. Her green gloves were lying on the grass next to a pile of dirt. Her small metal shovel was still in the ground. This was very strange. Martha loved her garden. She would not leave her tools outside in the dirt overnight. Then, Julian noticed something even more unusual. The heavy wooden front door of the house was wide open. It was not just a little bit open. It was pushed all the way back against the wall. A cold wind blew from the sea and went straight into the dark hallway of the house. "Martha!" Julian called out. His voice was loud in the quiet evening. No one answered him. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees. The leaves made a soft, rustling noise. Julian walked through the gate and onto the stone path. He felt a little bit of fear in his chest. He was a stranger in this town, but he felt he had to help his neighbor. He walked up the steps to the front porch. The wood under his boots made a sharp, snapping sound. He stood at the open door and looked inside. The hallway was very long and very dark. He could see a tall clock against the wall and a large mirror. The air inside the house felt much colder than the air outside. "Martha, are you there? It is Julian, your neighbor," he said again. He waited for a moment. He listened very carefully. He did not hear any footsteps. He did not hear any voices. The house was completely silent. It was a heavy, uncomfortable silence. He looked at the floor. There were some dry leaves in the hallway. The wind had blown them inside through the open door. Julian did not want to go inside a stranger's house. It was not polite. But the open door and the tools in the garden made him feel very nervous. He felt like something was wrong. He looked back at his own house. It was small and safe. Then he looked back into the darkness of Martha's home. He took a small step into the hallway. "Is anyone home?" he asked one last time. The only answer was the sound of the front door moving slowly in the wind. Julian realized that the peaceful life he wanted in Blackwood Bay was already changing. Julian felt a cold chill on his neck. He stepped back from Martha's dark hallway and went outside. He pulled the heavy wooden door shut. It closed with a loud, solid sound that echoed in the quiet air. He looked at the empty garden one last time. The sun was gone now, and the stars were beginning to appear in the sky. Julian did not want to stay in his quiet house alone. He needed to talk to someone who knew the town. He walked down the hill toward the harbor. The village of Blackwood Bay was small. Most of the buildings were made of old stone and wood. Near the water, there was a building with a bright yellow sign. It said The Anchor. This was the local pub. Julian could see a warm light coming from the windows. He heard the sound of people talking and laughing inside. He pushed the door open and walked in. The air inside was warm and smelled like fried fish and old wood. The ceiling was very low, and there were many pictures of old ships on the walls. A group of men sat at a long wooden table. They were wearing thick sweaters and heavy boots. Julian walked to the bar. A man with a very short grey beard and a navy blue sweater looked at him. He had deep lines on his face and large, strong hands. "You are the new man from the hill," the man said. His voice was deep and rough like the sound of stones moving in the water. "I am Captain Miller. I own the boats in the harbor." "I am Julian. It is nice to meet you, Captain," Julian said. He sat on a wooden stool. "I am looking for my neighbor, Martha. I went to her house, but the door was open and she was not there. Her garden tools were still in the dirt." The captain stopped cleaning a glass. He looked at Julian for a long time. "Martha is a good woman," he said slowly. "But she is old. Maybe she just forgot to close the door." A man sitting in a dark corner of the pub looked up from a notebook. He was wearing a clean white shirt and silver glasses. He looked very smart and serious. "The wind is very strong today, Julian," the man said. Perhaps the wind pushed the door open. "My name is Dr. Aries. I am a scientist. I study the water and the air here in the bay." Julian shook his head. The door was pushed all the way back. "And Martha loves her garden. She would not leave her tools outside in the cold." Dr. Aries stood up and walked to the bar. He moved very quietly. "Blackwood Bay is a strange place for a writer, Julian. The weather changes very fast. The fog can make people lose their way, even people who have lived here for a long time." The captain nodded. He took a heavy metal key from his pocket and put it on the table. "The sea is dangerous tonight. The waves are high. If Martha is out there, she should be careful." Julian looked at the two men. They seemed calm, but he felt they were not telling him everything. He looked at the window. The white fog was coming back. It moved against the glass like a ghost. Julian felt more worried than before. Julian left the pub and walked back up the hill. The fog was now very thick. He could not see the stars or the moon. He held his coat tightly against the cold wind. He thought about Captain Miller and Dr. Aries. They seemed very calm about Martha. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was just tired and went to bed early. Julian wanted to believe them, but he still felt a heavy weight in his chest. When he reached his house, he looked at Martha's home. It was still dark. There were no lights in any of the windows. He went inside his own house and locked the door. The house made a small, sharp sound when the lock turned. He went to his desk, but he did not write. He sat in the dark and listened to the ocean. The waves hit the rocks with a loud, rhythmic force. Julian did not sleep well that night. He had strange dreams about white clouds and empty houses. He woke up very early the next morning. The sun was behind a layer of grey clouds. The world looked pale and cold. He immediately went to his kitchen window. He looked at Martha's garden. Every morning at 7 o'clock, Martha was outside. She usually wore her bright green gloves and watered her red roses. Julian watched the clock on his wall. It was 7 o'clock. Then it was 7:30. Then it was 8 o'clock. The garden was empty. The red roses looked thirsty in the morning light. The green gloves were still lying on the grass. The small metal shovel was still in the dirt, exactly where it was the evening before. No smoke came from the chimney of Martha's house. The house looked cold and lonely. Julian went outside. The grass was wet with dew. He walked to the wooden fence between the two houses. "Martha!" he called out. His voice was thin in the morning air. "Martha, are you there?" He waited, but there was no movement inside the house. He walked to her front door. He remembered that he had closed it the night before. He tried to turn the handle. The door was locked now. This was even more confusing. Who locked the door if Martha was not there? Julian felt a cold shiver go down his back. He looked around the garden. He saw a small bird land on the birdhouse, but that was the only sign of life. He walked around to the back of the house. The kitchen window was high up. He could not see inside. He went back to his own house and picked up his phone. He did not have many friends in this town, but he knew he could not wait any longer. Something was definitely wrong. A woman like Martha did not leave her favorite tools in the dirt and disappear. Julian's hands were shaking a little bit. He found the number for the local police station. He had to report that his neighbor was missing. Julian waited by his front gate. He watched the road that led up the hill. Soon, a blue police car appeared. It drove slowly and stopped near the garden. The sound of the tires on the dry gravel was loud in the quiet morning. A tall man in a dark blue uniform got out of the car. He looked very serious. This was Officer Reed. He was a man in his 40s with short hair and very bright eyes. "Good morning, Julian," Officer Reed said. He walked toward the fence. "I received your call. You are worried about Martha." Julian nodded quickly. "Yes, officer. Please, look at the garden. Martha is always here at 7 o'clock, but her tools are still in the dirt. Her gloves are on the grass. She never leaves her things like this." Officer Reed looked at the red roses and the green gloves. He walked to the front door of the grey stone house. He tried to turn the handle, but it did not move. "You said the door was open last night?" he asked. He looked at Julian with a questioning expression. "Yes," Julian explained. "It was wide open. I closed it because it was cold. But this morning, it was locked. I do not know who locked it." Officer Reed reached for a heavy ring of keys on his belt. The metal keys made a sharp, clinking sound as he moved them. He found a master key and put it into the lock. There was a loud, solid click as the lock turned. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Julian followed him closely. The hallway was dark and very cold. It felt like no one had lived there for a long time. The air was thick and smelled like old wood. Officer Reed turned on a powerful flashlight. The bright beam of light moved across the wooden floor. "Martha!" Officer Reed called out. His deep voice echoed through the empty rooms. No one answered. The only sound was the soft rhythm of their own breathing. They walked into the kitchen. The room was very tidy. There were no dirty dishes in the sink. One white tea cup sat on the wooden table. Julian touched the side of the cup. It was cold. Martha had not used it for many hours. "Everything looks normal," Officer Reed whispered. "But the house feels wrong." Julian looked at the floor near the back door. He saw something small and white. He walked over and looked down. "Officer, look at this," he said. It was a small piece of paper. It was folded into a neat square. Officer Reed picked it up with his large hands. He unfolded the paper slowly. Julian saw that there was writing on it. But the letters were strange. They were not words. They looked like a secret code or a set of numbers. Officer Reed's face became very pale. He put the paper into his pocket and looked at Julian. "We need to check the upstairs rooms now," he said. His voice was different now. It was filled with a new kind of worry. Julian felt his heart beat faster. They started to walk toward the stairs. The old wood made a low, groaning sound under their heavy boots. Julian and Officer Reed climbed the stairs slowly. The wooden steps made a loud, groaning noise under their weight. The air on the second floor was even colder than the kitchen. Julian pulled his jacket tighter. The hallway upstairs was narrow and lined with several closed doors. The wallpaper was old and had patterns of small, faded flowers. The beam of Officer Reed's flashlight moved along the floor. Suddenly, the light stopped. It hit something that sparkled on the dark carpet. They both stopped walking. Directly in front of the door to the master bedroom, there was a mess. A large, blue glass vase lay in many sharp pieces across the floor. It was a beautiful vase that usually sat on a small wooden table in the corner. Now, the table was empty. The water from the vase had soaked into the carpet, leaving a large, dark stain. "Stay back, Julian," Officer Reed said quietly. "Do not step on the glass." Officer Reed moved closer. He used his flashlight to look at the pieces of blue glass. Julian looked around the hallway. He expected to see more mess. He expected to see a chair moved or a picture fallen from the wall. But everything else was perfect. The small table was still in its place. The pictures of Martha's family were still hanging straight on the walls. "This is very strange," Julian whispered. "The vase fell, but nothing else is broken. It is like someone dropped it on purpose." Officer Reed knelt down. He looked at the pieces of glass very carefully. There are no footprints in the water. He noted, if there was a fight, we would see marks on the carpet. But the water is still. It just sat there and soaked into the floor. Julian looked at the bedroom door. It was slightly open. Was Martha in her room? He asked. Officer Reed pushed the door open with the end of his flashlight. The door moved with a slow, smooth motion. The bedroom was very neat. The bed was made with a thick, white blanket. There were books on the nightstand and a pair of reading glasses. A lamp was sitting on the desk, but it was turned off. She did not sleep in her bed last night, Officer Reed said. He pointed the light at the smooth white blanket. There are no wrinkles. No one has touched this bed since yesterday morning. Julian felt a heavy sense of worry. Martha was gone. Her house was locked, a vase was broken, and she had not slept in her bed. He thought about the coded note in the officer's pocket. "What does it mean, officer?" Julian asked. "Why would someone break a vase and then leave everything else alone?" Officer Reed stood up and sighed. The sound was heavy in the silent room. "I do not know yet, Julian. But I think someone wanted to make a noise." Or perhaps they were looking for something hidden inside the vase. They left the bedroom and walked back into the hallway. Julian looked at the blue glass one last time. It looked like broken stars on the dark floor. The mystery of Blackwood Bay was becoming more dangerous with every step they took. Julian and Officer Reed walked out of the silent house. The bright morning sun did not feel warm anymore. The wind from the ocean was getting stronger. It moved the tall grass and made a low, whistling noise through the trees. Officer Reed looked at the small, coded note again. He looked worried. "I need to take this paper to the police station," Officer Reed said. "I want to see if our computers can understand these numbers. Stay away from the house for now, Julian. It is a crime scene." Julian watched the blue police car drive away. He was alone again. He looked at his own house, then at the grey stone house of his neighbor. He did not want to go inside and sit at his desk. He could not write his book while Martha was missing. He felt like he had to do something. He decided to walk behind the houses. There was a narrow path that led down to the beach. The path was steep and full of small rocks. As he walked down, the sound of the ocean became louder. The waves hit the shore with a heavy, rhythmic force. The white foam from the water flew into the air. The beach at Blackwood Bay was not a place for swimming. It was full of large, black rocks and cold, grey sand. The wind here was very powerful. It pushed against Julian's chest and made it hard to walk. He blocked his eyes from the flying sand. He walked along the edge of the water. He looked at the ground, hoping to find more footprints. But the tide was coming in. The water washed over the sand and erased everything. Then, he saw something dark near a large rock. It was not a rock, and it was not a piece of wood. It was soft and moved in the wind. Julian ran toward it. He reached the large rock and stopped. Lying on the wet sand was a heavy, dark green coat. He picked it up. The coat was very heavy because it was soaked with sea water. It was also covered in sand and small pieces of green seaweed. He held the coat up. It was a man's coat. It was much too big for Martha. It was also very expensive. The material felt like high-quality wool. Julian looked at the pockets. They were empty. But inside the collar, there was a small label with the name of a shop. The shop was in the big city, hundreds of miles away. Julian felt a cold shiver that was not from the wind. Why was a city man's coat on this beach? Who was wearing it? He looked out at the dark water. The waves were high and violent. He thought about the man in the pub, Dr. Aries. He also thought about Captain Miller. Did they know about this coat? Julian wrapped the wet coat in his own jacket. He knew he had to show this to Officer Reed. The mystery was no longer just about a missing neighbor. It was about something much bigger and more dangerous. He started the long climb back up the hill, feeling the weight of the wet wool in his arms. Julian carried the wet, heavy coat back to his house. He placed it in a large plastic bag. He wanted to keep it safe for Officer Reed. Then, he looked at his phone. There was a message from the officer. It said, "Julian, please look in Martha's house for a book of names and numbers. We need to call her family." Julian felt a bit nervous about going back inside. The grey stone house felt very lonely now. He walked across the grass and used the key that Officer Reed had left under a heavy flower pot. The door opened with a slow, smooth motion. The house was still very cold. The smell of old wood was even stronger than before. He went into the small office near the living room. This was where Martha kept her letters and bills. There was a large desk made of dark, heavy wood. It had many small drawers and a green lamp on top. The desk was very clean and organized. Julian began to look through the drawers on the right side. In the first drawer, he found some old pens and a box of stamps. In the second drawer, there were many envelopes and pieces of white paper. He looked for a black address book or a list of phone numbers, but he did not see one. He checked the third drawer. It was full of garden magazines and seeds for her roses. Then, Julian tried to open the large drawer at the very bottom of the desk. He pulled the metal handle, but the drawer did not move. He pulled harder, but it stayed shut. He looked closely at the wood. There was a small, silver keyhole hidden under the handle. This drawer was locked. Julian looked around the room. He looked on the bookshelves and under the green lamp. He looked inside a small porcelain bowl on the shelf. He did not find a key. He sat in Martha's wooden chair and thought, why would a kind woman like Martha lock a drawer in her desk? Most of her things were open and simple. He looked at the desk again. He noticed a small piece of wood near the back of the table. He pushed it with his finger. The wood moved a little bit. He pushed it harder, and a secret compartment opened. Inside the compartment, there was a small, old key. It was made of heavy iron. Julian took the key and put it into the lock of the bottom drawer. He turned the key slowly. The lock made a sharp, metallic sound. He pulled the handle, and the drawer slid open. The drawer was not full of phone numbers or names. Instead, it was full of old folders and yellow papers. There were maps of the bay and letters from many years ago. At the very top of the papers, there was an old envelope. It was thick and heavy. Julian's heart beat faster. He felt like he was close to the truth. He reached into the drawer to pick up the envelope. Julian's hands were shaking as he pulled the thick envelope from the secret drawer. The paper felt rough and dry. It smelled like old dust and salt. He sat back in Martha's wooden chair and carefully opened the flap of the envelope. Inside, there was a stack of old photographs. Most of them were black and white. He looked through them one by one. The first few pictures were of the harbor from many years ago. The ships looked different, with tall wooden masts and large white sails. The next few photos showed the village. The trees were smaller, and there were fewer houses on the hill. Then, Julian reached the last photograph in the stack. He stopped moving. He stared at the picture for a long time. It was a photo of two people standing on the beach at Blackwood Bay. They were standing in front of the large rocks where Julian found the wet coat earlier that day. A young woman was on the left. She had long, dark hair and a bright, happy smile. Even though she was much younger, Julian knew those eyes. It was Martha. She looked beautiful and full of life. But it was the man standing next to her that made Julian's heart freeze. He was a tall man with very broad shoulders. He wore a heavy navy blue sweater and a captain's hat. He had a strong jaw and a very serious expression. He looked exactly like Captain Miller. He had the same nose, the same deep lines around his mouth, and the same powerful hands. But in this photo, his hair was dark, and his face was smooth. Julian turned the photograph over. On the back, someone had written a short message in blue ink. The writing was elegant and careful. It said, "The Bay, 1986. Together always." Julian felt a wave of confusion. At the pub, Captain Miller acted like he was just a neighbor. He spoke about Martha like she was an acquaintance, not a close friend. But this photo showed a different story. They looked like they were in love. Why did the captain hide his history with Martha? Why did he act so distant? Suddenly, Julian heard a noise from outside. It was the sound of footsteps on the gravel path. They were heavy, slow footsteps. Someone was walking toward the front door of the house. Julian quickly put the photographs back into the envelope. He pushed the envelope into the secret drawer and closed it. He turned the iron key in the lock and hid it back in the small compartment. He stood up and looked out the office window. A tall figure was standing near the garden gate. The person was wearing a dark coat and a hat. Because of the shadows and the grey light of the evening, Julian could not see the person's face. The figure stood perfectly still, looking at the house. Julian stayed away from the window. He did not want to be seen. He realized that the mystery of Blackwood Bay was much older than he thought. It was a secret that started 40 years ago, and now it was coming back to the surface. Julian waited behind the curtain. The figure at the gate did not move. After a long minute, the person turned and walked away into the grey mist. Julian waited until he could no longer hear the sound of footsteps on the gravel. He knew he had to be brave. He opened the secret drawer one more time and took the envelope with the photographs. He put it inside his jacket. He left the house through the back door and walked quickly toward the harbour. The air was colder now, and the smell of the sea was very strong. He arrived at the Anchor pub. The warm light from the windows looked different to him now. It did not look safe. It looked like a place for secrets. He pushed the heavy door open. The pub was almost empty. Captain Miller was sitting alone at the far end of the bar. He was staring at a glass of water. His large hands were resting on the wooden table. He looked tired and old. Julian walked across the room. His boots made a rhythmic sound on the wooden floor. He sat down next to the captain. The older man did not look up. "Captain Miller," Julian said. His voice was steady. "I found something today. I think you should see it." The captain turned his head slowly. His eyes were dark and hard. "I told you, Julian. I don't know anything about Martha's disappearance. Leave it to the police." Julian did not listen. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the old photograph. He placed it on the bar, directly in front of the captain. The light from the lamp above them made the picture very clear. The captain looked at the photo. For a moment, his face changed. His eyes widened, and his hands began to shake. Then, his expression became very cold. He looked at Julian with a look of pure anger. "Where did you get this?" the captain asked. His voice was a low, dangerous growl. "I found it in Martha's desk." Julian replied. "It says, 'Together always,' on the back. Why did you lie to me? You knew her very well. You were more than just neighbors." The captain stood up suddenly. His chair fell backward and hit the floor. He slammed his hand down on the bar. The glasses on the shelf made a sharp, ringing sound. "You have no right to enter her house and steal her things," the captain shouted. His face was red. "You are a stranger here. You do not understand this town. You do not understand what happened 40 years ago. Then tell me the truth," Julian said. The captain did not answer. He grabbed his heavy coat from the hook. He stared at Julian for a final, silent moment. "Stay away from this, writer. Some secrets are better left in the dark." The captain walked to the door. He pushed it open with great force and stepped out into the night. The door closed. Julian was alone in the pub. He looked at the photograph on the bar. The young Martha and the young captain were still smiling, but the world around them was now full of shadows. Julian picked up the old photograph from the bar. He put it back inside his jacket pocket. He felt a deep sense of unease. The captain's anger was a warning, but Julian could not stop now. He was a writer, and writers always wanted to find the end of the story. He pushed the heavy pub door open and stepped outside. The world had changed in the short time he was inside. A thick, white fog had moved into the town. It was not a normal mist. It was so dense that Julian could not see his own feet. The streetlights were only small, pale yellow circles in the white air. They did not light up the road. They only made the fog look more mysterious. "This is incredible," Julian whispered to himself. The air felt heavy and wet against his skin. It was very cold. He started to walk toward the hill. He knew the way to his house very well. He walked past the small grocery store and the post office, but after a few minutes, he stopped. He looked around, but he did not recognize anything. The buildings were hidden behind the wall of white. The silence was absolute. Usually, he could hear the distant sound of the ocean, but even the sea was quiet now. Julian felt a small spark of fear. He moved slowly, keeping one hand on the cold stone walls of the buildings. He heard a soft sound of water dripping from a roof. He also heard the distant sound of a bell. It was a slow, rhythmic sound. It came from the direction of the water. Suddenly, a cold wind blew through the street. The fog moved and shifted like a living thing. For a second, the white air cleared. Julian saw a tall, dark shape standing in the middle of the road. It was a person. The person was not moving. They were just standing there, watching him. "Hello," Julian called out. His voice sounded flat and strange in the fog. "Is someone there? Is that you, Captain Miller?" The figure did not answer. It did not move. Julian took a step forward. He wanted to see the person's face, but the wind stopped, and the thick fog returned instantly. The figure disappeared into the whiteness. Julian's heart was beating very fast now. He turned around and tried to find the path to his house. He walked for what felt like an hour. He was tired and his boots were wet. Finally, he saw a familiar blue door. It was his house. He ran to the door and quickly went inside. He locked the door and leaned against it. He went to the window and looked out. There was nothing to see but the white fog. It pressed against the glass like a heavy blanket. Julian realized that Martha was right. The fog in Blackwood Bay was not just weather. It was a shield that kept secrets hidden from the world. He sat at his desk and waited for the morning, but he did not turn off the lights. The next day, the sun was hidden behind a layer of thin, grey clouds. Julian felt a little bit better after a long night of sleep. He sat at his desk and looked at his maps of Blackwood Bay. He had 3 different maps. One was very old, and 2 were modern. He looked at the coastline very carefully. He wanted to see if there was a place he missed during his walks. He decided to explore the north side of the bay. This area was very rocky and difficult to reach. There were no roads and no houses there. Julian put on his heavy boots and a warm hat. He took a bottle of water and his camera. He walked past the village and toward the tall cliffs. The ground was very uneven. There were large rocks and thick, thorny bushes. Julian had to move slowly. The wind from the ocean was very cold and strong. It made a loud, whistling noise as it moved through the gaps in the rocks. After walking for an hour, he found a narrow path. The path was hidden behind a wall of tall, yellow grass. Julian followed the path up a steep hill. His legs were tired, but he did not stop. When he reached the top of the hill, he stopped and stared. In front of him was a tall, circular tower made of white stone. It was a lighthouse, but it was in very bad condition. The white paint was falling off the walls in large pieces. The metal balcony at the top was rusted and orange. Many of the glass windows were broken. Julian quickly opened his modern maps. He looked at the north side of the cliffs. There was nothing there on the paper. The map showed only empty rocks. He looked at his second modern map. It was the same. The lighthouse was not there. "This is impossible," Julian said quietly. "A building this big cannot be a secret." He walked closer to the lighthouse. The air here smelled like old salt and wet stone. He saw a heavy iron door at the base of the tower. There was a large, rusted lock on the handle. On the ground near the door, Julian saw a small wooden sign. It was lying face down in the dirt. He picked it up. The wood was soft and rotten. On the sign, there were some faded black letters. They said, "Property of Blackwood Bay Research." Julian remembered Dr. Aries. The scientist said he studied the water and the air. Did he work here? Suddenly, a loud noise came from inside the tower. It was the sound of something heavy falling onto a stone floor. The sound echoed inside the building and came out through the broken windows. Julian froze. He stayed perfectly still and listened. He heard the sound of slow, heavy footsteps. They were coming from the other side of the iron door. Julian did not want to be found. He ran behind a large rock and hid. He watched the door, but it did not open. The footsteps stopped. Julian felt his heart beating very fast. He looked at the lighthouse one last time. It looked like a ghost standing on the cliff. He knew he had to tell Officer Reed about this place. He started to walk back toward the village, moving as fast as he could. Julian ran back toward the village. He wanted to find Officer Reed immediately. As he reached the main road near the high cliffs, he saw the blue police car. It was parked at the side of the road with its lights flashing. Officer Reed was standing near the edge of the cliff. He was looking down at a small blue car parked on the grass. Julian stopped next to him. He was breathing very hard. "Officer Reed," he called out. "I need to tell you about something I found." Officer Reed turned around. His face was very pale. He pointed at the blue car on the grass. "Look at this first. Julian. It is Martha's car." Julian looked at the vehicle. It was a small, older car. It was parked very close to the edge of the cliff. Below the cliff, the ocean waves were hitting the rocks with a loud, powerful force. The wind was very strong here. It moved the car slightly. Was she inside? Julian asked. He felt a knot of fear in his stomach. "No," Officer Reed said. "The car is empty." They walked closer to the small car. Officer Reed opened the driver's side door. Julian looked inside. The keys were still in the ignition. A brown leather purse sat on the passenger seat. Martha's glasses were lying on the floor. She would not leave her glasses. Julian whispered, "She needs them to see anything." Officer Reed looked at the ground around the car. The grass was flat, as if someone had walked there recently, but there were no clear footprints. The ground was too dry and rocky. Why would she drive here? Julian asked. "The road ends a mile back. This is just a path for walkers." Officer Reed shook his head. "I do not know. It looks like she stopped the car and just walked away. But where? The cliffs are dangerous. If a person falls into the water here, the ocean is too strong." Julian looked north, toward the area where he found the lighthouse. "Officer, I found a building. A white tower on the cliffs. It is a lighthouse, but it is not on any of my maps. I heard something inside it." Officer Reed looked surprised. "A lighthouse? There are no active lighthouses in Blackwood Bay. The old one was destroyed many years ago." "This one is there," Julian insisted. "It has a sign that says, Blackwood Bay Research. I think it is important." Officer Reed looked at Martha's empty car and then at the dark horizon. The sun was disappearing again. "We cannot go there now. Julian. The light is fading and the wind is too high. I need to call for a tow truck to move this car." Julian felt frustrated. He looked at the empty seat where Martha should be. He felt like they were losing time. He looked down at the dark water below. The mystery was growing, and now, it was at the edge of the world. Officer Reed was busy. He was looking inside Martha's brown purse. He wanted to find her identification card or a mobile phone. Julian stood by the open passenger door. The inside of the car smelled like Martha's lavender perfume and old paper. He looked at the glove box. It was not closed properly. One corner of a small white paper was sticking out from the gap. Julian reached inside and pulled the paper out. It was a small, square note. It felt thick and expensive, not like a normal piece of notebook paper. On the note, someone had written a few numbers and words in dark black ink. The handwriting was very sharp and tilted to the right. It said, 10 to 24, 12 o'clock. The Green Room. Julian showed the note to Officer Reed. "Look at this," he said. "I found it in the glove box." Officer Reed took the paper and held his flashlight over it. He frowned. "October 24th. That is next week. And 12 o'clock. Is it noon or midnight? And what is the Green Room?" Julian asked. He thought about the small village. He knew the grocery store, the post office, and the pub. There were no hotels or theaters with a room called that. Is there a place in town with that name? Officer Reed shook his head slowly. "Not that I know of. But this town has many old buildings with strange names." He put the note into a small plastic bag to keep it clean. "This is very strange. Julian. First the code in her house, and now this. Martha was always a quiet, simple woman. Why did she have these secrets?" Julian looked at the car's dashboard. There was a thin layer of grey dust on the plastic. But near the radio, the dust was moved. There were clear marks where fingers had touched the surface. It looked like someone had searched the car quickly and roughly. "I do not think Martha drove this car here alone," Julian said. He pointed to the driver's seat. "Look at the seat, officer. It is pushed back very far. Martha is a small woman. Her legs are short. She could not reach the pedals from this position." Officer Reed checked the seat. He pushed on it with his hand. He nodded his head. "You are right. A tall person drove this car to the cliff. Someone much taller than Martha." Julian thought about Captain Miller. He was a very tall man with long legs. He also thought about the expensive wool coat he found on the beach. Who was the tall driver? And where was Martha now? The wind began to make a loud, whistling noise around the metal body of the car. The sky was almost completely black now. The ocean below was a wall of dark, angry water. Julian felt a cold shiver. He felt like the car was a lonely monument on the edge of the world. "We should go," Officer Reed said. "The weather is turning bad again. The tow truck will be here soon to take the car. I will take this note to the station and see if I can find the Green Room in the Old Town records." Julian watched the officer walk back to the police car. He felt the small piece of paper was a key to the mystery, but he did not know which door it opened. He looked toward the north, where the secret lighthouse stood in the dark. The next morning, the sky was a dull gray. Julian could not stop thinking about the note. He needed to find the Green Room. He decided to go to the Blackwood Bay Library. It was a small, brick building in the center of the village. The walls were covered in thick, green vines. Julian pushed the heavy door open. Inside, the library was very warm and quiet. The air smelled like old paper and lemon wax. There were tall shelves full of books from the floor to the ceiling. A woman with silver hair and large, round glasses sat at a wooden desk. Her name was Mrs. Gable. She was the town librarian. "Good morning," Julian said softly. Mrs. Gable looked up and smiled. "Hello, Julian. Are you looking for a new book to read?" "Actually, I am looking for information about the history of the town," Julian explained. "I want to know if there is a place called the Green Room." "Do you know that name?" Mrs. Gable stopped smiling. She looked thoughtful. She tapped her chin with a small pen. "The Green Room," she repeated slowly. "That name sounds very familiar, but it is not a room in a house or a shop. Let me check the Old Town records." She stood up and walked to a small room at the back of the library. Julian followed her. This room was full of heavy, black books and old maps. Mrs. Gable pulled a large book from a high shelf. The book had the words Blackwood Bay, 1950 to 1990 on the cover. She placed the book on a table and turned the pages carefully. The paper was yellow and very thin. Finally, she stopped at a page with a photograph of the old lighthouse Julian had seen on the cliff. "Here it is," Mrs. Gable said. She pointed to a list of names. 40 years ago, a group called the Blackwood Bay Research Group used the lighthouse. They were scientists. They studied the weather and the ocean. They had several rooms in the tower. Julian looked at the list. He saw names like the map room, the radio room, and then, at the very bottom, the green room. The green room was at the very top of the lighthouse, Mrs. Gable said. They called it that because of the large green glass in the lamp. They were testing a new type of light that could see through the thickest fog. Julian felt a cold chill. "Who were the scientists?" he asked. Mrs. Gable looked at another page. There were 3 main scientists. One was a man from the city. Another was a local man named Thomas Miller. "Captain Miller?" Julian asked. "Yes," Mrs. Gable nodded. "He was a young man then. He helped them with his boats. And there was a young woman who helped with the records. Her name was Martha." Julian felt his heart beat faster. The pieces of the mystery were starting to fit together. Martha, the captain, and the lighthouse were all connected to a secret project from 40 years ago. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Julian said. He quickly left the library. He knew where he had to go next. He had to go back to the lighthouse, even if it was dangerous. Julian walked away from the library. He felt like his head was spinning with new information. Martha, Captain Miller, and the lighthouse were all part of a secret history. He wanted to go home and think, but he also felt like he was running out of time. He decided to take a shortcut through a small forest near the edge of the village. This path led directly to the hill where his house stood. The trees in the forest were tall and dark. Their branches reached out like long, thin fingers. Because the sun was low in the sky, the forest was full of long, moving shadows. The air was very still. Julian could only hear the sound of his own breathing and the dry leaves under his boots. He walked quickly. After a few minutes, he stopped. He thought he heard another sound. It was the sound of a dry branch breaking under a heavy foot. Julian turned around and looked back at the path. He saw only the dark trees and the grey mist. "Is someone there?" he asked. His voice was small in the large forest. No one answered. Julian started to walk again, but this time he moved faster. He heard the sound again. It was a rhythmic thudding of feet on the soft earth. The sound was behind him, and it was getting closer. Someone was following him through the trees. Julian did not look back again. He began to run. His heart was beating like a drum in his chest. He pushed past the low branches. They scratched his arms and his face, but he did not stop. The person behind him was also running. Julian could hear the heavy sound of their breath. It was the breath of an adult, loud and fast. He saw the light of the street at the end of the forest. He ran toward it with all his strength. He reached the edge of the trees and stumbled onto the gravel road. He did not stop until he reached his own front gate. He ran inside his house and locked the blue door. He stood in his dark hallway. He was shaking. He went to the window and looked out into the trees. For a second, he saw a tall, dark shadow standing at the edge of the forest. The shadow stayed perfectly still for a moment. Then, it turned and disappeared back into the darkness of the woods. Julian sat on the floor. He was too scared to turn on the lights. He realized that someone did not want him to find the truth about the green room. He was no longer just a writer watching a mystery. He was now a part of it, and someone was watching him. He stayed on the floor for a long time, listening to the wind hitting the walls of his house. Julian stayed in his dark hallway for an hour. He felt he had to tell Officer Reed about the shadow in the trees. He could not wait until the morning. He walked quickly down the hill to the small police station in the village. However, the station was quiet. Officer Reed was out on a patrol near the cliffs. Julian left a detailed message with the clerk and walked back to his house. The moon was hidden behind the grey clouds. The fog was thin, but it felt very cold against his face. When Julian reached his front gate, he stopped. He looked at his house. The blue front door was not closed. It was standing open just a few inches. A small yellow light from the hallway shined out into the night. Julian felt a cold sweat on his forehead. He was certain he had locked that door with his key. He walked up the wooden steps very slowly. The wood made a soft, creaking sound under his boots. He pushed the door open all the way. "Is someone here?" he asked. His voice was shaking. No one answered. The house was completely silent. Julian walked into his small office. He looked at his heavy wooden desk. He always kept his things very neat. His pens were usually in a straight line, and his notebook was always in the center. Now, his pens were scattered across the floor. He saw his book about the history of the bay. He had left it closed on the corner of the desk. Now, it was lying open in the middle of the workspace. Someone had been reading it. They were looking for something. Julian quickly reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. He felt the thick envelope with the old photographs. He had taken them with him to the police station. He let out a long breath of relief. They were looking for the pictures, Julian whispered to himself. He walked to the kitchen to check the rest of the house. He saw that the back window was wide open. The cold sea air was blowing inside, making the curtains move like ghosts. On the white floor, there were several muddy footprints. The marks were very large. They were the footprints of a man wearing heavy work boots. Julian felt a deep sense of fear. His home was no longer a safe place. He was being hunted in his own house. He realized that the person following him in the woods was the same person who entered his home. He closed the kitchen window and locked it tightly. He moved a heavy wooden chair and pushed it against the back door. He knew he could not sleep tonight. He sat in the living room with all the lights turned on. He held a heavy metal flashlight in his hand and waited for the sun to rise. The sun finally rose above the dark ocean. Julian felt very tired. He sat at his kitchen table and drank a cup of strong black coffee. His eyes were red because he did not sleep. He kept looking at the heavy wooden chair he had pushed against the back door. The house was quiet, but he did not feel safe anymore. Suddenly, his mobile phone made a short, sharp noise. He had a new message. He picked up the phone and read the screen. The message was from Dr. Aries. "Julian, I heard you are asking questions about the history of the bay. Come to my laboratory at 10 o'clock. I think I have the answers you are looking for." Julian felt a mixture of fear and curiosity. He knew Dr. Aries was a scientist. Maybe the doctor could explain the strange fog and the secret lighthouse. Julian got into his car and drove to the north side of the village. The road was narrow and full of sharp turns. The laboratory was a modern building made of glass and metal. It stood on a high cliff, not far from where Julian had found the old lighthouse. It looked very strange next to the old stone houses of the town. Dr. Aries was waiting at the front door. He wore a clean white coat and his silver glasses. He smiled, but his eyes stayed very serious. "Welcome, Julian," Dr. Aries said. "Please, come inside. It is much warmer in here." The inside of the laboratory was very different from the rest of Blackwood Bay. The walls were bright white. There were many large computer screens and silver machines. The machines made a low, constant humming sound that filled the room. Julian saw glass tubes filled with bubbling green and blue water. "What exactly do you do here, Doctor?" Julian asked. He looked at a large screen that showed a moving map of the ocean waves. "I study the energy of the bay," Dr. Aries said. He walked over to a table and picked up a small glass bottle. "Blackwood Bay is not a normal place. There are scientific anomalies here. An anomaly is something that is not normal or natural. The water and the air here create a special kind of power. This power is what causes the thick, heavy fog." Julian thought about Martha and the old lighthouse. "Does this power have anything to do with the green room?" he asked. Dr. Aries stopped moving. He looked at Julian for a long time. The room became very quiet. The only sound was the low hum of the machines. "You have been doing a lot of research, Julian. The green room was a project from 40 years ago. We are trying to understand it better now. The fog is a natural power, but it can be dangerous if people do not respect it." Julian felt like Dr. Aries was choosing his words very carefully. The scientist did not seem like a bad man, but he was definitely hiding something. Julian looked at the machines and the bright lights. He felt like he was close to the truth, but the truth was more complicated than a simple mystery. "I want to show you something," Dr. Aries said. He walked toward a large desk at the back of the room. Dr. Aries walked to a large, flat desk at the back of the laboratory. He pressed a button on the side of the table. A soft light came from under the glass surface. Suddenly, a large, detailed map appeared. It was a map of Blackwood Bay, but it was much more complex than the ones Julian had at home. It showed the depths of the water, the height of the cliffs, and the location of every building in the town. Julian walked closer. He looked at the map carefully. He noticed that some parts of the map were marked with bright red circles. He felt a cold sensation in his stomach. The first red circle was on the north side of the cliffs. It was exactly where Julian had found the old, hidden lighthouse. The second red circle was in the village. It was placed directly over Martha's house. There was also a thin red line that connected the house to the lighthouse. "Why are these places marked?" Julian asked. He looked at Dr. Aries. The scientist was standing very still. He looked tired, and his hands were moving nervously. "These are the areas with the highest levels of energy," Dr. Aries explained. His voice was very quiet now. "We call them focal points. The fog starts at the lighthouse and moves toward the village. For some reason, it always stops at Martha's garden. We are trying to understand why." Julian looked at the map again. "But Martha is a person, not a scientific location. Why would her house be a part of your research?" Dr. Aries adjusted his glasses. "Martha's family has lived in that house for a very long time. Her father was one of the first people to study the bay in the 1940s. He knew secrets about the water that we are only discovering now. We think he hidden some very important documents in that house." Julian thought about the secret drawer he found in Martha's desk. He thought about the old photographs and the maps he saw there. He realized that Dr. Aries was probably the person who searched his house. The scientist wanted those documents. "Is that why Martha disappeared?" Julian asked. His voice was stern. "Did she have something you wanted?" Dr. Aries shook his head quickly. "No, Julian. I am a scientist, not a criminal. I wanted to help her. The energy in the bay is changing. It is becoming stronger and more dangerous. I think Martha knew this was happening. I think she went to the lighthouse to try and stop it." Julian did not know if he could trust Dr. Aries. The map showed that the scientist was watching Martha's house very closely. He felt like he was standing in the middle of a large spider web. "I need to go," Julian said. He began to walk toward the door. "Wait," Dr. Aries called out. "Be careful, Julian. You are asking many questions. There are people in this town who want the fog to stay forever. They do not want the truth to be found." Julian did not look back. He walked out of the bright, humming laboratory and into the cold grey afternoon. He looked at the cliffs. He knew his next step was the lighthouse. He had to find Martha before the fog became too thick to see the truth. Julian remained by the glowing desk. He pointed his finger at the red circle over Martha's house. You said her father knew secrets. What kind of secrets? Dr. Aries wiped his forehead with a white handkerchief. He looked at the heavy metal door of the laboratory, then back at Julian. His eyes were wide behind his silver glasses. He seemed afraid that someone was listening. It is not just about the weather, Julian, the doctor whispered. The energy here is a physical force. 40 years ago, they built something in the green room at the lighthouse. It was a machine. It used the natural power of the bay to create a barrier of fog. Julian felt a cold shiver. A barrier. Why would they want to hide the town? Not the town, Aries replied. They wanted to hide the ships. Big, illegal ships. They carried things that were not allowed to be found. Martha's father discovered the machine, and he tried to stop it. But he could not destroy it completely. And now? Julian asked. Now, the machine is starting again, Aries said. He pointed to the red circle at the lighthouse. Someone is in the green room. They are using the old technology. Every time they turn it on, the energy levels near Martha's house go up. That is why the fog always stops there. Her house is built on a specific type of rock that acts like a wall. Julian looked at the map. The red lines looked like veins of fire on the screen. If the machine keeps running, what will happen to Blackwood Bay? Dr. Aries looked at his computer screens. The numbers were moving very fast. The fog will become too thick. It will stay forever. We will not see the sun again. And more importantly, the energy will become unstable. It could cause a massive disaster on the cliffs. Julian realized the danger was real. Is Martha trying to stop the machine? Is that why she went there? I think so, Aries said. He looked at the floor. She found the old keys in her desk. She knew the machine was waking up. But she is an older woman. She cannot fight a powerful force alone. Julian thought about the tall shadow in the trees and the man in the expensive coat. She is not alone. Someone else is there too. I saw a man on the beach. I saw a shadow in the woods. They are following me. Dr. Aries grabbed Julian's arm. His grip was surprisingly strong for a scientist. Then you must be very careful. Those people do not want the machine to stop. They want the fog. It is their protection. It helps them move their cargo without the police seeing them. Julian pulled his arm away. He had the answer he needed, but it made him more afraid than before. The mystery was no longer about a missing neighbor. It was a battle for the future of the town. He had to go to the lighthouse. He had to find Martha before the energy destroyed the bay. Dr. Aries turned toward a wall of small television screens. He pressed a key on a keyboard. The screens flickered and then showed black and white videos. The videos were old and grainy. They showed men in long coats standing on the beach. They were moving large wooden crates from small boats into the dark caves under the cliffs. This was the beginning, Dr. Aries said. He pointed to the screen. 40 years ago, a group of powerful men from the city wanted a place to hide their business. They called it Project White Wall. They did not want the police or the government to see their ships. So, they hired scientists to find a way to hide the bay. Julian watched the video. He saw the thick fog begin to rise from the water in the video. It looked like a wall of smoke. They created the weather, Julian whispered. He was shocked. Exactly, Aries replied. They used the natural energy of the ocean and amplified it. The green room was the center of everything. It held the main control for the machine. Martha's father, Henry, was a lead engineer. He thought he was helping the town's economy. But when he saw the illegal ships, he tried to turn the machine off forever. Julian looked at the bubbling green tubes in the lab. But you said it is starting again. Why now? Why after 40 years? Dr. Aries sighed. He looked very old in the bright light of the laboratory. Money. Julian. The men from the city are back. They have more advanced technology now. They want to use the old lighthouse as a base again. They are building a new version of the machine. They want the fog to be even thicker and more permanent. Is that who is in the lighthouse now? Julian asked. The men from the city. Yes, Aries said. And they have a leader. A man who wears expensive clothes and never shows his face to the townspeople. I think he is the one who took Martha. She knew too much about the old machine. She had the original blueprints and the master keys. Julian felt a surge of anger. Martha was a kind neighbor who just wanted to grow her roses. These men were using her and her family history for their own greed. He looked at the window. The grey sky was getting darker. The fog was starting to crawl up the sides of the cliff again. If the machine reaches full power, Aries warned, the energy will become too much for the old stone tower. It will explode, and the cliffs will fall into the sea. The whole north side of the village will be gone. Julian knew he couldn't wait for the police. Officer Reed was a good man, but he did not understand the science or the history. Julian had to act. He had to find the entrance to the lighthouse that was not guarded. Is there another way in? Julian asked. Dr. Aries hesitated. Then, he walked to a shelf and pulled out a heavy, rusted iron key. There is an old maintenance tunnel. It starts under the cliffs and goes up into the basement of the tower. But it is very narrow and dangerous. The tide is coming in soon. Julian took the key. It was cold and heavy. Tell me where it is, he said. He was no longer just a writer. He was a man on a mission to save his friend and his new home. Julian left the modern laboratory with the heavy iron key in his pocket. He felt the cold weight of the metal against his leg. He did not go back to his house. Instead, he drove down to the harbor to find Officer Reed. He found the police car parked near the old wooden docks. Officer Reed was standing by the water, looking at the dark, white-capped waves. Officer! Julian called out as he stepped out of his car. I have new information. Dr. Aries told me about the lighthouse. It is part of an old project. He gave me a key to a secret tunnel. Officer Reed turned around. He looked very tired. There were dark circles under his eyes. I know about the lighthouse now, too. Reed said. I found some old records at the station. But we have a bigger problem. Someone reported seeing a light in that tower last night. A green light. Julian nodded. Aries said the machine is starting again. We have to go there, officer. Martha is in danger. Officer Reed looked at the stormy sky. The weather is very bad, Julian. The wind is getting stronger. But you are right. We cannot wait for the state police to arrive tomorrow. Get in the car. They drove together toward the North Cliffs. The road was dangerous and full of deep holes. The police car bounced and shook as they moved higher up the hill. Finally, they reached the spot where the road ended. They had to walk the rest of the way. The walk to the lighthouse was difficult. The wind made a loud, angry noise as it hit the rocks. It was hard to stand straight. Julian and Reed moved slowly, using their flashlights to see the narrow path. The white tower of the lighthouse appeared through the grey mist. It looked like a giant, broken tooth standing against the sky. They reached the heavy iron gate that surrounded the base of the tower. The gate was very tall and had sharp metal spikes at the top. Officer Reed moved his flashlight along the bottom of the gate. Suddenly, he stopped the light. Julian, look at that. Reed said. His voice was very serious. Caught on a sharp, rusted piece of the gate was a small scrap of bright blue fabric. Julian walked closer and picked it up. The cloth was soft and made of high-quality wool. He knew this color. He had seen Martha wearing a long blue scarf many times while she worked in her garden. "It is hers," Julian whispered. He felt a sharp pain of worry in his heart. This is a piece of Martha's scarf. She was definitely here. She must have been pushed against the gate. The piece of cloth moved in the wind, like a small blue flag. It was a sign of a struggle. Martha did not go into the lighthouse because she wanted to. She was forced inside. Officer Reed pulled his heavy black flashlight from his belt. "This is now a rescue mission," he said. "The front gate is locked from the inside. We cannot break it. Julian, where is that maintenance tunnel?" Julian reached into his pocket and felt the iron key. He looked at the dark rocks below the cliff. "It starts down there," he said. "Under the tower. We have to go down to the water." Julian and Officer Reed could not enter the maintenance tunnel yet. The tide was too high. The ocean waves were crashing against the dark rocks with great power. The entrance to the tunnel was completely covered by cold, salty water. Dr. Aries was right. It was too dangerous to go inside now. "We must wait for 3 hours," Officer Reed said. He looked at his watch. "The water will go down then. Let's go back to your house, Julian. We can prepare our equipment and stay warm for a moment." They drove back to the small white house. Julian sat at his wooden desk. He felt a deep sense of urgency. He took the small, square note from the plastic bag. He also took the first coded paper they had found in Martha's kitchen. He placed them side by side under the yellow light of his desk lamp. 10 to 24. 12 o'clock. The green room. Julian read aloud. He looked at his calendar on the wall. His heart stopped for a second. Today was October 24th. He had been so busy with the mystery that he had lost track of the days. "Officer, look." Julian pointed at the calendar. "Today is the 24th. That means the meeting, or the event, is happening tonight." "And 12 o'clock?" Officer Reed asked. "Is it noon or midnight?" Julian looked at the second paper. It was covered in long strings of numbers. He began to compare the numbers to the scientific charts Dr. Aries had shown him in the laboratory. He saw the number 24 appearing many times. Next to it was the word peak. "I think I understand," Julian said. He used a pencil to circle the numbers. "These are not just dates. They are energy levels. The bay reaches its highest energy level at midnight during the high tide of October 24th. That is when the machine in the green room will reach full power." He realized that Martha had discovered this. She wasn't just a victim. She was a researcher. She had calculated the exact moment the Project Whitewall would become permanent. The note wasn't an invitation to a meeting. It was a warning about the end of the town. "We have less than 4 hours," Julian whispered. He felt a heavy weight of responsibility. If they did not stop the machine by midnight, the fog would never leave. The village of Blackwood Bay would disappear behind a wall of white forever. He thought about Martha. She was probably near that machine right now. She was waiting for the clock to strike 12. Officer Reed stood up and checked his belt. He made sure he had his flashlight and his radio. The water should be low enough now. "We need to move, Julian. We cannot let that clock reach midnight." Julian grabbed his heavy jacket and the iron key. He felt like a character in one of his own books. But this was real life. There was no room for mistakes. He followed the officer out the door, leaving the decoded notes on the desk. The countdown had truly begun. Julian and Officer Reed walked out of the small white house. The air was colder than before. The wind moved the branches of the trees, making long, dancing shadows on the grass. Julian reached for the handle of his front gate, but he stopped suddenly. He looked at his blue front door. There was a new piece of paper attached to the wood. It was held in place by a small, sharp metal nail. Julian was certain it was not there 5 minutes ago when they entered the house. Someone had walked onto his porch while they were inside talking. "Officer, look at the door," Julian said. His voice was very quiet. Officer Reed turned around quickly. He used his flashlight to see the paper. He did not touch it yet. He looked at the ground and the wooden steps, but there were no muddy marks this time. Whoever left the paper moved very quietly and very fast. Julian stepped closer and read the words. They were written in large, messy capital letters with a red marker. The message was short and scary. "Go home before it is too late. They are watching us," Julian whispered. He looked at the dark forest across the road. He felt like 100 eyes were hidden in the trees. "They know we are trying to stop them." Officer Reed took a photograph of the note with his phone. Then, he pulled the paper off the door. "This is a threat, Julian. These men are desperate. They have spent 40 years waiting for this night. They will do anything to keep their secret." "I'm not going home," Julian said firmly. He thought about Martha. She was alone in that cold stone tower. She did not have a police officer or a friend to help her. "We have to go to the tunnel now." They walked to the police car. Officer Reed drove with the lights off. He did not want the people in the lighthouse to see them coming. They parked the car far away from the cliffs and walked the rest of the way in the dark. The path down to the water was very steep and dangerous. Julian followed the officer's lead. They used the rocks to stay steady. Below them, the ocean was still loud, but the water was moving away from the shore. The tide was going out. At the base of the high cliff, Julian saw a dark opening in the rock. It was a small hole, hidden behind a curtain of green seaweed. This was the entrance to the maintenance tunnel. The air coming from the hole smelled like old wet earth and cold metal. Julian took the iron key out of his pocket. His hands were cold, but his heart was full of determination. He looked at the lighthouse high above them. It was a black shape against the grey clouds. Somewhere at the top, a small green light began to pulse. It looked like a slow, beating heart. "It is time," Officer Reed said. He turned on his flashlight and pointed it into the dark tunnel. "Stay close to me, Julian, and do not make a sound." The entrance to the maintenance tunnel was even smaller than it had looked from a distance. Julian had to bend his head low to avoid hitting the jagged, wet ceiling. The walls were covered in thick patches of slippery moss and black barnacles that scraped against his jacket. Officer Reed led the way, his powerful flashlight cutting through the heavy, damp air. As they moved deeper into the cliff, the sound of the crashing ocean began to fade, replaced by a strange, metallic echo. Every step they took on the wet stone floor felt loud, like a drum in the silence. "The tunnel is rising," Officer Reed whispered. The beam of his light moved across the floor. "We are walking directly under the foundation of the lighthouse now." Suddenly, the flashlight hit something that wasn't stone or seaweed. Lying in the middle of the path was a heavy, industrial flashlight. It was made of yellow plastic, and the lens was cracked. Julian picked it up. It was still warm to the touch, and the batteries inside were dead. "This doesn't belong to Martha," Julian noted, showing it to the officer. "This is a professional tool. Someone was here very recently, maybe the people following us." They continued forward until the tunnel ended at a massive iron door. The door was covered in layers of rust and salt, but it looked incredibly strong. There was no handle, only a single, large keyhole in the center. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out the heavy iron key Dr. Aries had given him. His fingers were cold and shaking as he pushed the key into the lock. It was a perfect fit. He turned the key with all his strength. The sound of the lock opening was deafening in the small space. The heavy door swung inward with a slow, groaning protest. Beyond the door was a spiral staircase made of rusted metal. The air here was different. It was dry and smelled of hot electricity and ozone. From somewhere high above them, Julian heard a low, vibrating hum. It wasn't the sound of the wind or the sea. It was the sound of a powerful engine waking up. The vibration was so strong that Julian could feel it in his teeth. "The machine," Officer Reed said, his hand moving to the holster on his belt. "It's running at a low frequency. They are warming it up for the midnight peak." They began to climb the stairs. Each step made a sharp clink that echoed up the hollow center of the tower. Julian looked up. High above, he could see the faint glow of green light reflecting off the stone walls. They were inside the heart of the mystery now, and the clock was ticking toward 12. Julian felt a surge of adrenaline. They were close. He could feel it. But he also knew that once they reached the top, there would be no more hiding. The spiral staircase felt endless. Julian's legs ached, and his breath came in short, sharp gasps. The walls of the lighthouse were sweating. Beads of cold condensation rolled down the stone like tears. With every floor they ascended, the green glow intensified, turning the shadows into sickly, flickering shapes. They reached a wide stone landing. Unlike the lower levels, this area was filled with modern equipment. Thick black cables snaked across the floor, pulsing with a low, rhythmic light. Computer monitors sat on makeshift wooden tables, their screens filled with scrolling green data and topographical maps of the bay. Officer Reed held up a hand, signaling for Julian to stop. He pointed toward a heavy wooden door at the far end of the landing. Above the door, a brass plate was polished until it shone. It simply said, "The Green Room." From behind the door came the sound of voices. One was deep and calm. The other was sharp and filled with fear. Julian's heart jumped. He recognized the second voice. It was Martha. "You don't understand the balance," Martha was saying, her voice trembling but defiant. "You're not just making fog. You're tearing the fabric of the bay's natural cycle. If you hit the peak, the pressure will collapse the cliffs. The cliffs are a small price to pay for the invisibility we require, Martha." A man replied. His voice was smooth, like expensive silk. "The world is changing. We need a place where the modern eye cannot reach. Blackwood Bay will be that place." Julian looked at Officer Reed. The officer nodded, his face set in a grim mask. He moved toward the door, his boots making no sound on the cables. Julian followed, his pulse thundering in his ears. Through a small, circular window in the door, Julian saw the interior of the Green Room. It was a massive chamber filled with the ancient lighthouse lens, a giant, multifaceted crystal. But the crystal wasn't white. It was glowing with a blinding, emerald intensity. Surrounding the lens were several high-tech projectors, focusing beams of light directly into the glass. Martha was tied to a chair in the corner of the room. Her face was bruised, and her blue scarf was missing, but her eyes were bright with anger. Standing over a control panel was a man Julian had seen only in shadows. He was tall, wearing the expensive dark coat Julian had found on the beach. He must have had another. His hair was perfectly silver, and he held a gold pocket watch in his hand, checking the time with cold precision. 5 minutes to midnight. The man said. Officer Reed didn't wait any longer. He kicked the door open. "Police." "Nobody move." The tall man didn't flinch. He slowly turned around, a thin, cruel smile touching his lips. "Ah, the local law and the curious writer. You're just in time for the finale." The air in the green room was thick with the smell of ozone and the heavy vibration of the machine. The tall man, whom Silas Vance, as he introduced himself with a mock bow, seemed entirely unbothered by Officer Reed's drawn weapon. "Officer, please," Silas said, his voice smooth and cold. "If you fire that weapon, you might hit the glass. If the Fresnel lens shatters while the energy is at this frequency, we won't just have fog. We'll have a vacuum that pulls this entire cliff into the Atlantic." Julian looked at the massive glass structure. It was a masterpiece of 19th century engineering modified with 21st century horrors. The crystal facets were vibrating so fast they appeared blurred. Silas Vance was standing by the main console, his hand hovering over a final sequence lever. Martha was still tied to the chair, her eyes darting between Julian and a small emergency panel beneath the main lens. Officer Reed was stuck in a standoff, unable to shoot for fear of a catastrophic explosion. The machine was emitting a high-pitched whine that made Julian's ears bleed. "Julian!" Martha shouted over the roar of the machine. "The cooling vents. The red lever under the primary housing. If you open them now, the energy will dissipate before the peak." Silas's eyes snapped to Julian. The mask of calm slipped, replaced by a snarl. "Stay back, writer. This is decades of work. You're a tourist in a story you don't understand." Julian didn't think. He dove past a row of computer monitors, sliding across the slick stone floor toward the base of the lens. He saw the red lever Martha was talking about. It was covered by a protective glass case. "Stop him!" Silas screamed to a shadow in the corner. From the darkness behind the lens, the tall figure from the woods emerged. It was the man in the heavy work boots, the one who had broken into Julian's house. He moved with a brutal, heavy speed, his hand reaching out to grab Julian's collar. "Reed!" "The guard!" Julian yelled. Officer Reed tackled the guard just as he reached Julian. The two men crashed into a table of equipment, sending sparks flying into the air. Julian reached the red lever. He smashed the glass case with the heavy iron key he still held in his hand. The green light turned a blinding, angry white. The entire lighthouse began to sway. "It's too late." Silas laughed, his voice hysterical. "The sequence has started. The white wall is rising." Julian grabbed the red lever. It was hot, scorching hot, but he wrapped his jacket around his hand and pulled with everything he had. The red lever moved with a soul-crushing grind of metal on metal. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a roar of escaping steam filled the green room. White vapor erupted from the cooling vents, obscuring everything in a thick, hot mist. The high-pitched whine of the machine plummeted into a low, dying groan. The emerald light inside the Fresnel lens flickered, pulsed once more with a weak, sickly glow, and then vanished. The room plunged into sudden, heavy darkness, save for the narrow beams of Julian's and Reed's flashlights. "No!" Silas Vance's voice was a ragged scream of despair. 40 years. It was supposed to be perfect. Julian heard the sound of a struggle and then the metallic click of handcuffs. Officer Reed's voice rose through the steam, steady and calm. "Silas Vance, you are under arrest for kidnapping, endangerment, and about a dozen federal crimes I haven't even named yet." Julian scrambled toward the corner. His hands found the ropes binding Martha. He used a small pocket knife to slice through them. Martha slumped forward, and Julian caught her. She was shaking, but she gripped his arm with surprising strength. "You did it, Julian," she whispered, her voice raw. Look at the window." Julian turned. The vibration had stopped. The silence in the lighthouse was absolute, broken only by the distant, natural sound of the waves. Outside the broken glass of the green room, the impossible was happening. The thick, artificial fog was not just moving, it was dissolving. It broke apart into thin, wispy clouds that the morning wind carried away. For the first time in days, perhaps the first time in decades for the people of Blackwood Bay, the horizon appeared. A thin line of gold began to bleed across the edge of the Atlantic. The sun was rising. It touched the dark water, turning the angry waves into a field of sparkling blue and silver. Below the cliffs, the village of Blackwood Bay emerged from the gloom, its colorful houses looking like bright jewels in the early light. 1 week later, Julian sat at his wooden desk in the small white house. The blue door was fixed, and the mud had been scrubbed from the floors. Beside him sat a fresh cup of coffee and the old photograph of Martha and the captain. Captain Miller had visited him the day before. He hadn't said much, he wasn't a man of many words, but he had left a bottle of expensive scotch and a simple note. "Thank you for bringing her back." It turned out the captain had been trying to find the lighthouse entrance for years, haunted by the secrets he'd helped bury as a young man. Martha was back in her garden. Julian looked out the window and saw her. She was wearing her bright green gloves, carefully pruning her red roses. She looked up and waved at him, a genuine, peaceful smile on her face. Julian turned back to his typewriter. He took the first page of his manuscript, the one about the boring history of the bay, and set it aside. He fed a fresh sheet of paper into the machine. He began to write. The mystery was solved, the secret project was dismantled, and the village was safe. But as Julian looked at the sparkling water of the bay, he knew he wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. Blackwood Bay had finally shown him its true face, and it was a story he wanted to be a part of for a very long time. The celebration in Blackwood Bay lasted only a few days. The sun was out, the fog was gone, and the tourists began to return to the rocky shores. Julian Thorne, however, could not find peace. He sat in his study, the manuscript of his new book sitting unfinished. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the hum of the machine. It was a ghost sound, a phantom vibration that seemed to tickle the back of his skull. One rainy Tuesday evening, Julian was cleaning his desk when he bumped his old shortwave radio. The device crackled to life, hissing with white noise. He reached out to turn it off, but his hand froze. Beneath the static, there was a sound. It was rhythmic. It was deliberate. Julian turned the dial slowly, fine-tuning the frequency. The clicking became a series of tones, high and low. It was Morse code. Julian grabbed a pen and a scrap of paper, his heart hammering against his ribs. He hadn't used Morse since he was a boy in the Scouts, but the patterns were etched into his memory. Subsector still active. Subsector B still active. Julian stared at the paper. The Project White Wall was supposed to be dead. Silas Vance was in a federal holding cell, and the lighthouse machine was a pile of melted scrap and salt-crusted iron. Who was sending a signal? And where was Subsector B? He looked out his window toward Martha's house. The lights were off, which was unusual for 8 o'clock. Martha usually sat by her fireplace reading until 10. A sudden, sharp sense of dread washed over him. He grabbed his coat and ran across the damp grass. "Martha!" He called out, knocking loudly on the heavy oak door. There was no answer. He tried the handle. It was locked. Julian walked around to the garden, his flashlight cutting through the drizzle. The red roses he had seen her pruning just days ago were wilting. Not from the weather, but from something else. The soil looked grey and oily. He moved his light toward the garden shed. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, he found Martha's gardening gloves lying on the floor, but they weren't green anymore. They were coated in a strange, glowing silver dust. Julian heard a crunch of gravel behind him. He spun around, his flashlight beam swinging wildly. For a second, he saw a pair of boots, expensive, polished leather, disappearing behind the stone wall of the cliff path. "Stop!" Julian shouted, but the figure was fast. He didn't follow. Instead, he looked back at the radio signal he had transcribed. If Subsector B existed, it meant the lighthouse was only the tip of the iceberg. The fog hadn't been the goal. It had been the camouflage for something much larger buried beneath the bay. Julian knew there was only one person who might have the keys to the town's older, darker secrets. Captain Miller. The captain had been quiet since the night at the lighthouse, spending most of his time on his boat, the Wanderer, or tucked away in the back corner of the pub. When Julian entered the Anchor, the atmosphere was different. The locals weren't laughing. They were huddled in small groups, whispering. The television behind the bar was muted, showing news footage of strange seismic activity recorded off the coast of Maine. Julian found Miller at a small table, staring at a nautical map that looked like it belonged in a museum. The captain didn't look up when Julian sat down. "You heard the radio, didn't you?" Miller asked. His voice was like grinding stones. "How did you know?" Julian replied, startled. "Because the birds have stopped singing, Julian. Look at the harbor. The gulls left 2 days ago. They know when the earth is screaming." Miller pointed to a spot on the map, miles away from the lighthouse, right in the center of the deepest part of the bay. Subsector B. It's not on land. It's an underwater station, built during the Cold War. They didn't just want to hide ships, they wanted to hide a base. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. Silas Vance mentioned a white wall. But Dr. Aries said the energy was natural. Was he lying too? Aries is a scientist. Miller spat. He sees numbers. He doesn't see the greed. The men Vance worked for, the Obsidian Network, they don't care about fog. They care about the minerals under the seabed. The fog was just to keep the government's satellites from seeing the drilling rigs. Suddenly, the lights in the pub flickered and died. A low, heavy thud vibrated through the floorboards, shaking the glasses on the shelves. It felt like an earthquake, but it was too focused, too rhythmic. "They're starting the secondary pumps," Miller whispered, his eyes wide with a fear Julian had never seen in him. "If they pull too much pressure from the vents, the seafloor will collapse. The whole bay will be sucked into a whirlpool. We have to stop them." Julian said, "Where is Martha?" "I went to her house, and she's gone." Miller finally looked Julian in the eye. "She didn't tell you, did she?" "Martha isn't just a neighbor, Julian. She was the head of security for the original project. She didn't go to the lighthouse to stop the machine. She went there to hide the evidence of what's happening now." Julian's world tilted. The kind woman who grew roses and made tea was a soldier for the very organization he was trying to stop. Every memory he had of her felt like a lie. Julian returned to his house, but he didn't go inside. He went back to Martha's garden shed. He needed to see that silver dust again. He put on a pair of rubber gloves and carefully collected a sample of the oily soil in a glass jar. He remembered Dr. Aris's laboratory. Even if the man was hiding things, he had the equipment to tell Julian what this substance was. As he drove through the darkened village, he noticed black SUVs parked at odd intervals along the road. Men in suits stood near them, watching the dark water. The Obsidian Network was no longer hiding. He reached the lab and found the doors unlocked. The humming of the machines was gone, replaced by a haunting silence. "Doctor!" Julian called out. He found Dr. Aries in the back room, frantically packing papers into a briefcase. The scientist's hair was a mess, and his glasses were cracked. "Julian! You shouldn't be here." Aries hissed. "They're coming for the data. All of it. Tell me what this is." Julian said, slamming the jar of silver dust onto the table. Aries looked at it and recoiled as if the jar contained a venomous snake. "It's ferrofluid. Highly ionized. They use it to stabilize the pressure in the deep-sea drills. But it's leaking. If it's in Martha's garden, it means the subterranean pipes have ruptured. The energy is bleeding into the groundwater. Captain Miller says Martha was part of the project." Julian challenged. "Is that true?" Aries paused, his hands trembling. She was the keeper. Her job was to ensure the secret stayed in Blackwood Bay. But she grew a conscience. Julian. She realized that the Project White Wall wasn't just a shield. It was a weapon. She's been trying to sabotage the underwater pumps from the inside for months. Then where is she? They took her to Subsector B. Ares said, snapping his briefcase shut. There's an elevator hidden in the sea caves beneath the old cannery. But you can't go there. It's a death trap. I've already been followed by men in expensive coats and shadows in the woods. Julian said, his voice hardening. I'm already in the trap. I might as well see how it ends. Ares reached into his pocket and handed Julian a small, electronic keycard. This will get you into the elevator. But listen to me, Julian. If the silver dust is already at the surface, the structural integrity of the bay is at 5%. You have less than 6 hours before the ocean claims this town. The old cannery sat on the far edge of the harbor, a skeleton of rusted corrugated metal and rotting wood. It had been closed since the 70s, a place where local teenagers went to dare each other to enter. Julian parked his car a half-mile away and approached on foot, staying low in the tall, salt-stiffened grass. The smell of rotting fish and sea salt was overwhelming. Julian reached the perimeter fence and found a hole large enough to crawl through. Inside, the cannery was a maze of rusted machinery and empty vats. He followed the sound of water. In the center of the main floor, a large section of the concrete had been removed, revealing a dark, square shaft that dropped straight down into the earth. Beside it stood a modern, high-speed elevator, its sleek chrome finish looking completely out of place in the ruins. Julian looked at the keycard Ares had given him. He felt a moment of hesitation. Once he went down, there was no guarantee he was coming back up. He thought about his unfinished book, his quiet life in the city, and the blue door of his house. Then he thought about Martha, tied to a chair or worse, and the silver dust poisoning the roses. He swiped the card. The elevator doors slid open. As he stepped inside, the doors closed, and the floor dropped away with a stomach-churning lurch. A digital display on the wall began to count the depth in meters. 50 meters. 100 meters. 200 meters. The temperature inside the car began to drop. Julian could hear the massive weight of the ocean pressing against the shaft. The elevator slowed, and the doors opened into a world of white light and sterile glass. It was a city under the sea. Julian stepped out into a long hallway. To his left and right, massive reinforced windows looked out into the dark depths of the Atlantic. Floodlights illuminated the seabed, where giant robotic drills were clawing at the earth, surrounded by clouds of that silver, oily dust. "Welcome to the engine room of the world, Mr. Thorne." A voice boomed over the intercom. It wasn't Silas Vance. It was a woman's voice, cold, professional, and familiar. "Martha." Julian whispered, looking at the cameras mounted in the corners of the ceiling. "Martha is a name for the surface, Julian." The voice replied, "Down here, I am Director Wyland, and you really should have stayed in your garden." At the end of the hallway, a door opened, and 2 guards in black tactical gear stepped out, their rifles aimed directly at Julian's chest. The transition from the rustic, fog-shrouded village of Blackwood Bay to the cold, clinical halls of Subsector B was jarring. Julian stood with his hands raised, the cold barrels of the tactical rifles tracking his every breath. The hallway was a masterpiece of pressurized engineering, curved walls of reinforced carbon steel and thick acrylic viewports that held back the crushing weight of the Atlantic. "Move," one of the guards commanded. His voice was muffled by a sleek, black respirator mask. Julian was led down the corridor toward a massive circular chamber. As he walked, he looked out the windows. The seabed was a chaotic construction site. Giant crab-like machines moved through the silt, their mechanical claws dripping with the silver ferrofluid Dr. Ares had warned him about. It looked like a colony on a different planet, a secret world built right beneath the feet of the unsuspecting villagers. They reached the central hub. The room was dominated by a holographic display of the bay, pulsing with red data points. At the center of it all sat Martha, or Director Wyland. She was no longer wearing her gardening apron and green gloves. She wore a sharp, charcoal gray suit, her hair pulled back into a tight, severe bun. She looked decades younger, fueled by a terrifying, focused energy. "Sit, Julian," she said, gesturing to a sleek chair. Her voice lacked the warmth of the woman who had once brought him lemon cakes. "I suppose you feel betrayed. That is the risk of becoming a character in someone else's story. You lied about everything," Julian said, his voice echoing in the sterile room. "The lighthouse, the kidnapping, the roses. Was any of it real?" Martha leaned forward, her eyes cold. "The danger was real. Silas Vance was a fool, a mid-level manager who thought he could play God with the fog. I allowed him to think he was in charge so I could observe how the town reacted to the energy spikes. But Silas was a distraction. This," she gestured to the machines outside the window, "is the reality. We are harvesting the core isotopes that the fog was merely a byproduct of. Dr. Aries said you were trying to stop it," Julian countered. Martha laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Poor Aries. I told him what he needed to hear to keep him working for me. I'm not stopping the pumps, Julian. I'm accelerating them. The surface world is dying, its resources spent. The Obsidian network is securing the future. If Blackwood Bay has to sink to provide that future, then so be it." "You're talking about mass murder," Julian whispered. "I'm talking about evolution," Martha replied. She checked a monitor. "In 4 hours, the final extraction begins. The vacuum created will pull the crust inward. The village will be gone, and the world will have a new source of infinite power. And you, Julian, will have the best seat in the house for the end of the world." Julian was taken from the central hub and thrown into a small, high-pressure holding cell. The door hissed shut, sealing him in a room no larger than a walk-in closet. The walls were smooth, featureless metal, and the only sound was the low, vibrating hum of the station's life support systems. He sat on the floor, his mind racing. He had been a fool. Every clue he had found, every secret he had uncovered, had been breadcrumbs laid out by Martha to keep him occupied while the real work continued below. Even the rescue at the lighthouse had likely been a staged event to neutralize Silas Vance and clear the way for Director Wyland's final phase. He reached into his pocket and felt the small, electronic keycard Dr. Aries had given him. He had used it to get into the elevator, but would it work on this door? He doubted it. Martha was too smart to leave him with a functional tool. Suddenly, the hum of the room changed. A vent in the ceiling hissed, and a familiar voice whispered through the static of a hidden speaker. "Julian, can you hear me?" It was Captain Miller, but the voice wasn't coming from a radio. It was coming from the station's internal comms. "Captain, where are you?" Julian whispered, looking up at the vent. "I'm in the ventilation shafts," Miller said, his voice strained. "I followed the backup pipes from the sea caves. Listen to me. Wyland thinks she has everything under control, but she's forgotten the old machinery. The lighthouse wasn't just a fog generator, it was the primary pressure vent for the whole subsector. The machine is destroyed, Captain," Julian reminded him. "The surface part is, yes," Miller replied. "But the underground coupling is still there. If we can trigger a backflow from the lighthouse basement, we can jam the underwater pumps. It would cause a localized explosion here, but it would save the village." "Localized explosion? You'd be killed. Better me than the whole town, lad," Miller said. "I'm going to bypass your door lock from the junction box. When it opens, Run to the emergency escape pods on level 4. There's a manual override for the lighthouse vent there. You have to pull it at the exact moment the extraction starts. What about Martha? Julian asked. She's already gone, Julian. Miller's voice was grim. That woman you knew. She never existed. Now, get ready. On my mark. A series of sparks showered from the ceiling, and the door to the cell hissed open. Julian didn't wait. He burst out of the cell and into the hallway. The station was in a state of high alert. Red emergency lights were spinning, and the intercom was barking orders in a language Julian didn't recognize. Scientists and technicians were running toward the upper levels, carrying crates of data drives and equipment. He stayed low, moving against the flow of traffic. He remembered the map Dr. Aries had shown him. Level 4 was the lowest part of the living quarters, situated directly beneath the main laboratory. As he reached the stairwell, he encountered a group of guards. He ducked behind a heavy equipment crate, his heart thumping. He needed a distraction. Looking around, he saw a fire suppression canister mounted on the wall. He grabbed a heavy metal wrench from a nearby tool belt and smashed the valve. Thick, white foam sprayed into the hallway, creating a blinding cloud. The guards shouted, their boots slipping on the slick floor. Julian used the chaos to slip past them, darting up the stairs 2 at a time. He reached level 4 and found himself in a long, dark corridor lined with escape pods. These were small, spherical vessels designed to launch through the seabed and float to the surface. At the very end of the row was a heavy console marked with a yellow and black hazard stripe. Manual pressure vent override. He ran to the console, but his way was blocked. Standing there, holding a small, silver pistol, was Dr. Aries. But he wasn't the panicked scientist from earlier. He looked calm, almost bored. I really hoped you wouldn't make it this far, Julian. Aries said. It makes my job so much more complicated. Aries. You're working for her too. Julian stopped, his hands up. Working for her? No. Aries smiled. Martha works for me. She's a brilliant administrator, but she lacks the vision for the science. I'm the one who designed the extraction process, and I can't have you venting the pressure before the isotopes are secured. The town will fall into the sea, Aries. People will die. Progress requires a foundation. Aries said, his finger tightening on the trigger. And sometimes, that foundation is built on the ruins of the past. A loud clang echoed through the corridor. Aries spun around, but he wasn't fast enough. Captain Miller had dropped from a ceiling vent, landing on the scientist with the weight of an anchor. The pistol skittered across the floor. Go, Julian. Miller roared, pinning Aries to the ground. Pull the lever. Julian lunged for the console. The digital clock on the wall read 11:58 p.m. He grabbed the heavy iron handle of the manual override. It was locked. A red light on the panel blinked. Biometric authorization required. It needs a fingerprint. Julian yelled. Miller, still struggling with Aries, looked up. The guard. The one you saw earlier. He has a master bypass key on his belt. Julian looked back toward the stairwell. The foam-covered guards were approaching. He saw the lead guard, the one who had captured him. He wasn't wearing a mask anymore. Julian froze. It was the face from the old photograph. The one Silas Vance had claimed was a young Captain Miller. But it wasn't Miller. It was a younger version of the man Silas Vance had been. Vance's own son, working deep undercover. The guard raised his rifle. Julian dove for the scientist's dropped pistol. He didn't want to kill, but he had no choice. He fired a shot into the overhead steam pipe. A blast of hot vapor filled the air, knocking the guard off balance. Julian scrambled over, grabbed the bypass key from the guard's belt, and ran back to the console. He jammed the key into the slot and twisted. The screen turned green. Manual vent open. He pulled the lever. Deep beneath the station, a series of massive valves groaned open. The sound was like a giant intake of breath. The station shuddered violently. Outside the windows, the silver ferrofluid began to be sucked back into the pipes, moving away from the seabed and toward the lighthouse vents on the surface. "What have you done?" Aries screamed, breaking free from Miller. "The pressure differential will implode the station. It'll save the town," Miller said, standing up and wiping blood from his lip. "That's all that matters." The floor beneath them buckled. A massive crack appeared in the acrylic window. A thin stream of high-pressure seawater hissed into the room, cutting through a metal table like a laser. "Get to a pod, Julian," Miller shouted, pointing to the nearest sphere. "Not without you. I have to stay to make sure the vent doesn't close," Miller said, his voice softening. "Tell Martha. Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't save her from herself." Miller shoved Julian into the escape pod and slammed the hatch. Through the small porthole, Julian saw Miller walk to the console and wrap his arms around the lever, holding it in place as the water began to fill the room. The pod launched. Julian felt a crushing force as the sphere was shot through the seabed. He looked back one last time. Subsector B was collapsing in on itself, a tiny spark of light extinguished by the immense weight of the dark, cold ocean. Above, the stars were beginning to fade. The sun was rising on a Blackwood Bay that would never know how close it had come to disappearing. The escape pod breached the surface of the Atlantic with a violent surge of white foam. For several long seconds, Julian Thorne sat in the cramped, metallic sphere, his lungs burning and his ears ringing from the pressure change. The small porthole was obscured by salt spray and the orange glow of the morning sun. He was alive, but the silence outside was terrifying. He fumbled with the manual release of the hatch. It groaned against the internal pressure before swinging open, letting in a blast of freezing sea air. Julian climbed out onto the top of the pod, which bobbed like a cork in the choppy waters of the bay. The view was devastating. A mile away, near the base of the North Cliffs, a massive whirlpool was still subsiding. The sea was a churning mess of white water and dark debris. The secret lighthouse, once a proud if decaying monument, had partially collapsed into the ocean. The ground beneath it had given way when the pressure vents had been forced open, creating a sinkhole that had swallowed the tower's foundation. "Miller," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. He scanned the horizon, hoping to see another pod, a life jacket, or even a piece of wood. But the bay was empty. The Obsidian Network's deep-sea city was gone, buried under millions of tons of salt water and sediment. The extraction had been halted, but the cost had been the life of the only man who truly knew the town's history. As the tide pushed his pod toward the shore, Julian noticed something floating in the water near him. It was a bright red rose, its petals remarkably intact despite the chaos. He reached out and plucked it from the salt water. It wasn't a real flower, it was a synthetic imitation, the kind Martha used to decorate her indoor vases. It was a final, mocking message from Director Wyland. He looked toward the village. Blackwood Bay was still there. The colorful houses on the hill were untouched, and the morning smoke was beginning to rise from the chimneys. The people were waking up, blissfully unaware that a war had been fought beneath their feet. Julian felt a sudden, crushing weight of loneliness. He was the only witness left to the truth, and he knew that in a town built on secrets, the truth was a dangerous thing to carry alone. He reached the rocky shore near the old cannery. His legs felt like lead as he stumbled onto the dry land. He didn't go to the police station. He didn't go to the hospital. He walked back to his small white house, the salt drying on his skin, his heart as cold as the depths he had just escaped. Julian spent the next 48 hours in a state of sleep-deprived delirium. He sat by his window, watching Martha's house. It remained dark and silent. The police had cordoned off the North Cliff area, citing unstable geological conditions. But they hadn't come to his door. It seemed that with the destruction of Subsector B, the Obsidian network had vanished into the shadows, pulling their strings and erasing their footprints. On the third morning, Julian found a package on his doorstep. It was a simple wooden box, weathered by the sea. There was no note, no return address. Inside was a series of journals bound in dark leather. He opened the first one and recognized the elegant, careful handwriting from the back of the old photograph. These were Martha's personal diaries, dating back to 1986. He began to read, and the world shifted once again. May 12, 1986. Henry says the machine is nearly ready. He calls it the Great Eraser. He believes the fog will protect us from the world. But I see the way the men from the city look at the water. They don't want protection. They want a cage. As Julian turned the pages, he saw the slow transformation of a young, idealistic woman into a cold strategist. Martha hadn't been a villain from the start. She had been a victim of the project, forced to choose between the destruction of her town and a life of service to the network. She had played both sides for decades, trying to find a way to neutralize the power without triggering a catastrophe. October 14, 2025. Julian Thorne has arrived. He is curious. Too curious. I must play the part of the lonely neighbor. If he digs too deep, the network will eliminate him. I will use the fog to distract him. It is the only way to keep him alive. Julian dropped the book. Every clue he had found, the open door, the broken vase, the coded note, hadn't been a mistake. They had been Martha's way of leading him to the truth, while simultaneously making him look like a harmless, bumbling writer to her superiors. She had saved his life by making him a nuisance rather than a threat. He walked out into his garden and looked over the fence at Martha's roses. They were truly dying now. Without the ionized energy of the pumps to feed them, the synthetic soil was failing. You weren't a monster. He whispered to the empty house. You were a prisoner. A flash of light caught his eye. Someone was standing in the window of Martha's office. A tall figure, perfectly still. Julian's breath hitched. He ran to the fence, shouting her name. But as he reached the gate, the figure moved back into the shadows. By the time Julian reached the front door and peered through the glass, the room was empty. 2 weeks passed. The official story from the government was that an illegal offshore drilling operation had caused a localized seismic event. There was no mention of lighthouses, fog machines, or underwater cities. Silas Vance had vanished from custody, his records erased from the system as if he had never existed. Julian was summoned to a private meeting at the town hall. He expected to find Officer Reed, but instead, the room was filled with men in dark suits he didn't recognize. At the head of the table sat a woman with sharp features and a cold, measuring gaze. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice like ice. "I am Agent Halloway from the Department of Energy. We've been reviewing your manuscript." She tapped a thick stack of papers on the table. It was Julian's book, the one he had barely started. They had taken it from his house while he was sleeping. "It's a work of fiction," Julian said, his voice steady despite the fear rising in his chest. "It's a very detailed work of fiction." Halloway replied. "So detailed that it contains classified technical specifications for a pressurized isotope extraction system that doesn't officially exist. We would like to know where you got your inspiration." Julian realized then that the war wasn't over. The Obsidian Network wasn't just a rogue corporation. It was woven into the very fabric of the agencies that were supposed to regulate it. "I'm a writer," Julian said. "I have a vivid imagination. I saw a lighthouse. I saw some fog, and I filled in the blanks." "We suggest you keep the blanks filled with imagination, Mr. Thorne," Halloway said, leaning forward. "The village of Blackwood Bay has suffered enough. The people are happy. The sun is shining. It would be a shame if another seismic event occurred because someone decided to publish a book that disturbed the peace. It was a blatant threat. Julian looked around the room. He saw the faces of the men he had seen in the SUVs, the ones who had watched the water. They were the law now. What about Martha Wyland? Julian asked. There is no record of a Martha Wyland in this town. Holloway said, her face expressionless. The house next to yours is owned by a holding company. It has been vacant for 10 years. You must have been mistaken about your neighbor, Mr. Thorne. Perhaps the isolation of the coast is getting to you. Julian left the town hall, his skin crawling. They were gaslighting him, erasing the very existence of the woman who had saved them all. He realized he couldn't stay in his house anymore. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage. Julian packed his bags that night. He didn't take much, just his laptop, his clothes, and Martha's journals, which he had hidden beneath the floorboards. He intended to drive back to the city, to lose himself in the crowds where the shadows couldn't find him. As he was loading his car, his old shortwave radio, sitting on the passenger seat, crackled to life. Julian froze. He grabbed the radio, his fingers trembling. He tuned the frequency, expecting Morse code, but instead, he heard a voice. It was faint, distorted by miles of ocean and rock, but it was unmistakable. The anchor is not at the harbor, Julian. The anchor is in the archives. The voice was Captain Miller's. Captain! You're alive! Julian shouted into the receiver, but there was no reply. The signal died, replaced by the empty hiss of the night air. Julian looked at his car, then back at the village. The archives. The town didn't have a formal archive building, but the library, Mrs. Gable's library, had a basement full of records that went back to the founding of the colony. He knew he should leave. Every instinct told him to drive away and never look back, but the thought of Miller being alive, trapped somewhere or hiding, was too much to ignore. He drove to the library. The building was dark, the green vines looking like black snakes in the moonlight. He used the emergency key Mrs. Gable had shown him during his first visit, his heart pounding against his ribs. The library was silent, the smell of old paper and lemon wax now feeling oppressive. He made his way to the back room, to the heavy book Mrs. Gable had used to find the green room. He looked at the shelf where the book had been, but it was gone. In its place was a small, black stone, a piece of obsidian. He touched the stone, and a section of the bookshelf slid back with a soft hiss. Behind it wasn't a room, but a ladder leading down into a dark, narrow shaft. At the bottom of the ladder, Julian found a small, reinforced room. It was filled with vintage radio equipment and monitors that were still flickering with life. On the main screen, a map of the world was displayed, with dozens of red dots blinking across the oceans. Blackwood Bay was just one of many. On the desk sat a small, brass anchor. Julian picked it up and realized it was a USB drive. He plugged it into the main console, and a video began to play. It was Miller. He looked exhausted, his face covered in soot. But he was in a room that looked like a submarine. If you're seeing this, Julian, then Wyland's erasers have started their work. They think they destroyed Subsector B, but they only destroyed the shell. The network is global. They are harvesting the Earth's marrow, and Blackwood Bay was just the testing ground. Miller leaned closer to the camera. I'm not dead, but I can't come home. I'm on the inside now. I found Martha. She's not who we thought. Neither of them are. There's a third player, Julian, the one who truly runs the Obsidian network. He's been in the village the whole time. The video cut to a grainy photograph taken in the village square. It showed Julian himself, walking to the grocery store, and standing in the background, watching him with a chillingly familiar smile, was Dr. Aries. But Aries was standing next to someone Julian hadn't expected to see. It was Mrs. Gable. The cold air of the library basement felt like a physical weight on Julian's shoulders. He stared at the screen, the image of Mrs. Gable, the sweet, silver-haired woman who had offered him lemon tea and local gossip, standing beside Dr. Aries. Her smile in the photograph wasn't the warm expression he remembered. It was calculated, the look of a collector who had just found a rare and fragile specimen. "Do you like what you see, Mr. Thorne?" The voice didn't come from the video. It came from the ladder behind him. Julian spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy brass anchor on the desk. Mrs. Gable was descending the rungs with a grace that defied her age. She wasn't wearing her round spectacles. Her eyes were sharp, clear, and predatory. She stepped onto the stone floor, her sensible wool cardigan replaced by a high-collared black coat that seemed to swallow the light. "I expected you to leave," she said, her voice devoid of its grandmotherly lilt. "I had a bet with the director that you would take the car and drive until you hit the city lights." "I'm disappointed, Julian. Curiosity is a terrible trait in a man who lacks the means to protect himself." "You're the archivist," Julian said, his voice steadying. "You didn't just find the records for me. You wrote them. You've been curating the history of this town to hide the network for years." Mrs. Gable walked to the console, her fingers dancing over the keys with terrifying familiarity. "History is a messy thing, Julian. People remember the wrong details. They remember the screaming of the wind or the way the fog felt like fingers on their throats. My job is to ensure the narrative remains manageable. Blackwood Bay isn't a town. It's a laboratory. And every lab needs a record keeper." "Where is Miller?" Julian demanded. Mrs. Gable sighed, a sound of genuine pity. "Thomas was a mistake. A local boy who grew too fond of the scenery. He thinks he's an insurgent, but he's simply a variable we haven't solved yet. As for Martha, well, Martha is currently undergoing a realignment. She forgot that her loyalty belonged to the Obsidian Network, not to the soil of this wretched cliff." She turned to face him, the red dots on the global map reflecting in her pupils. "You found the USB drive. You think you have the truth. But truth is subjective. The isotopes we are extracting are the only things that will sustain the human race when the surface becomes uninhabitable. We aren't the villains of your book, Julian. We are the authors of the next era." She pressed a button on the console. A hidden door in the basement wall slid open, revealing a row of sleek, black pods, not for escape, but for transport. "The director wants to see you," she said. "And in this library, Mr. Thorne, we don't allow late returns." Julian found himself forced into one of the transport pods. It wasn't the clunky, vibrating sphere of the escape pod. This was a maglev shuttle, silent and terrifyingly fast. Mrs. Gable sat opposite him, watching him with the detached interest of a biologist observing a moth in a jar. The shuttle moved through a series of vacuum-sealed tunnels that cut deep into the continental shelf. Julian realized the scale of the operation was beyond anything he had imagined. This wasn't just a base, it was a sprawling, subterranean empire. "Why me?" Julian asked as the shuttle hummed through the darkness. "I'm just a writer. I'm nobody." "On the contrary," Mrs. Gable said. "You are a catalyst. The network has spent 40 years in the shadows, but the white wall is failing. The world is starting to notice the anomalies. We need a voice. Someone to frame the transition. Someone the public will trust when the time comes to announce the new sovereignty." "You want me to write your propaganda?" Julian scoffed. "I want you to write the gospel," she corrected. "We have the technology to reshape reality, Julian. We can heal the atmosphere, provide infinite energy, and erase poverty. But people fear what they don't understand. They need a story. They need a hero. We've been grooming you since the moment you looked at that for rent sign in the city." The shuttle slowed to a halt. The doors slid open to reveal a chamber that dwarfed the central hub of Subsector B. This was the Nexus. It was a cathedral of glass and light, built into a massive natural cavern. At the center was a pulsing core of pure, iridescent energy, the harvested isotopes, glowing with a light that felt like it was vibrating through Julian's very bones. In the center of the room, standing on a floating platform, was a man Julian had seen only in the grainy, distorted files of the archive. He was older, his face etched with the lines of 1,000 difficult decisions, but his eyes were the same piercing blue as Martha's. "Julian," the man said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "I am Henry Wyland, Martha's father, and the man you've been looking for." Julian stepped out of the shuttle, his mind reeling. "They said you died in '86. They said you tried to stop the machine." "I did stop the machine," Henry said, stepping off the platform as it lowered to the floor. "The old machine. It was inefficient. It was a blunt instrument. I didn't want to hide the bay. I wanted to harness it. My daughter thought I was a monster, so she killed me and took over the project. But Martha was always too emotional. She lacked the stomach for the final extraction." He gestured to the pulsing core. "Welcome to the heart of the world, Julian. I hope you brought your pen. We have a lot of history to rewrite." The Nexus was a sensory assault. The air tasted of ozone and a strange, metallic sweetness that Julian realized was the scent of the isotopes. Henry Wyland walked with a slight limp, but his presence was commanding. He led Julian toward the edge of the central pit, where the energy core swirled like a captive nebula. "You think we are destroying the world," Henry said, looking down into the light. "But the world is already destroyed. The climate, the politics, the soul of humanity, it's all rot. We are simply preparing the lifeboats." "And who gets to get on the lifeboats, Henry?" Julian asked. "The people of Blackwood Bay. Or just the men in the black SUVs?" Henry turned, a shadow of a smile on his face. The village was a filter. Those who stayed, those who could endure the fog and the silence. They are the ones with the resilience to survive the transition. But their obsidian network is larger than a village. It is a meritocracy of the brilliant and the bold. He tapped a glass panel, and the holographic display changed. It showed the global map again, but this time, the red dots were connected by a web of golden lines. Every dot is a harvesting station. We are drawing the planet's latent energy into a singular grid. Once the grid is at 100%, we can manifest a permanent white wall, not just over a bay, but over the entire northern hemisphere. A sanctuary of perfect, controlled climate. And the rest of the world? The rest of the world will follow its natural course. Henry said coldly. "We cannot save everyone, Julian. Evolution is a series of subtractions." Suddenly, a series of alarms began to blare. The golden lines on the map flickered and turned red. Henry's composure broke. He lunged for the console. "What is this?" Subsector C is reporting a feedback loop. A familiar voice crackled over the speakers. But it wasn't Miller this time. It was Martha. "Father," she said, her voice sounding amplified and distant, as if she was speaking from a great height. "You always said I lacked the stomach for the final extraction. But you forgot that I'm the one who designed the security protocols for the global grid." "Martha, where are you?" Henry roared. "I'm in the green room, Father. The real one. The one you built under the library." Martha replied. "Julian found the key, but I found the lock. I've reversed the polarity of the harvesting stations. Instead of pulling energy in, we are venting it back into the Earth's core. The grid is collapsing." Henry's face turned a deep, angry red. He looked at Julian, then at Mrs. Gable. "Kill him," he hissed. And find her. Mrs. Gable didn't hesitate. She reached into her black coat and pulled out a sleek, silenced pistol. Julian didn't wait for her to aim. He threw the heavy brass anchor, the USB drive still attached, directly at the glowing core of the Nexus. The anchor struck the containment field. For a split second, there was a blinding flash of violet light. The energy of the isotopes reacted violently with the foreign metal. A shockwave rippled through the room, throwing Mrs. Gable to the floor and shattering the glass viewports. Julian scrambled toward the transport shuttle, the ground beneath him shaking with the fury of a man-made earthquake. He saw Henry Wyland screaming at the monitors, his lifeboats disappearing one by one from the map. The anchor! Julian yelled into his comms, hoping Martha could hear him. The drive has the archive data. It's hitting the core. I see it, Julian. Martha's voice was triumphant. The data is corrupting their control sequence. The whole network is blind. The cavern began to groan. Massive stalactites of limestone fell from the ceiling, crushing the delicate machinery. Mrs. Gable scrambled to her feet, her face a mask of rage, but a falling support beam pinned her to the floor before she could fire. Julian reached the shuttle just as the doors began to close. He saw Henry Wyland standing at the edge of the pit, silhouetted against the roaring violet light of the collapsing core. The architect didn't move. He simply watched his empire dissolve into the very energy he had tried to steal. The shuttle launched, the maglev system straining against the shifting tunnels. Julian felt the weight of the mountain pressing down on him. The vibration was so intense he could feel his teeth rattling. Martha! Miller! Do you hear me? We're here, Julian. Miller's voice came through, sounding like he was on a boat. We're at the harbor. The water is rising, but the fog is gone. The real fog. The shuttle burst out of a hidden exit in the side of the north cliff, skidding across the gravel and coming to a halt just yards from the edge of the ocean. Julian kicked the door open and tumbled out onto the wet grass. The sun was setting, but the sky wasn't orange. It was a brilliant, shimmering violet. The energy of the Nexus was venting into the atmosphere, creating a northern lights display that covered the entire horizon. He looked toward the library. It was a ruin. The ground beneath the village was settling, the secret tunnels collapsing. Martha and Miller were waiting for him by the police car. Martha looked exhausted, her charcoal suit torn and stained with soot. Miller had his arm around her, his face grim but relieved. Is it over? Julian asked, his voice a whisper. Martha looked up at the violet sky. The network is broken. The grid is gone. But the world will never be the same, Julian. We've given the Earth back its energy, all at once. The weather, the tides, they're going to change. Then we have a new story to write. Julian said, looking at the village. The houses were still standing. The people were coming out of their doors, looking at the sky in wonder. Not just a story. Martha said, reaching into her pocket and pulling out a small, green gardening glove. A future. A real one this time. The violet light did not fade with the setting sun. Instead, it deepened, pulsing in time with a low thrum that seemed to vibrate out of the very bedrock of the village. Julian stood on the cliffs, flanked by Martha and Miller, watching as the residents of Blackwood Bay trickled out of their homes. They weren't screaming. They were silent, their faces bathed in the eerie, neon glow of a sky that defied every law of meteorology they knew. It's beautiful, Miller whispered, though his hand remained gripped tightly around the hilt of his flare gun. But it feels like a warning. It's the atmosphere ionizing. Martha explained, her voice devoid of its director persona. She looked smaller now, stripped of the Obsidian Network's clinical armor. The energy we vented, it's interacting with the ozone layer. We've changed the chemistry of the sky above the bay. Maybe the world. The ground beneath them gave one final, heavy shudder. A mile out at sea, the water erupted in a geyser of white steam where the nexus had finally collapsed into the cooling vents. The whirlpool vanished, replaced by a hauntingly calm surface that reflected the violet heavens like a dark, polished mirror. Julian looked at his hands. They were stained with the dust of the tunnels and the dried salt of the Atlantic. He felt like a man who had been hollowed out and filled with a story too heavy to carry. What happens to them now? He asked, gesturing to the villagers. They think it was an earthquake. They think the sky is just a rare aurora. They'll believe what they need to believe to sleep at night. Miller said grimly. But the government won't be so easy to fool. Holloway and her erasers will be here by dawn. They'll want to know why their global grid just went dark. Martha turned to Julian. The coldness in her eyes had been replaced by a weary desperation. The data on that anchor, Julian. It's the only thing that proves what my father was doing. It's the only thing that proves we didn't just cause a terrorist attack. If Holloway gets it, she'll use it to rebuild the network under a different name. You have to hide it. Hide it. Julian scoffed. I'm the first person they're going to search. I'm the curious writer, remember? Not if you aren't here. Martha said. She looked toward the harbor, where Miller's boat, the Wanderer, was already idling, its lights cutting through the violet haze. The network is global, but they've lost their eyes. For the next 24 hours, there is a blind spot in the world. You need to take the boat and get to the city. Go to the one person Holloway can't touch. Who? Julian asked. Martha leaned in, her voice a ghost of a whisper. The man who funded the original opposition. The one my father thought he had killed 40 years ago. Henry's twin brother, Arthur Wyland. Before they reached the harbor, Julian insisted on one final stop, the library. He couldn't leave the village without knowing for certain that Mrs. Gable's last archive was truly dead. They found the building slumped into its own foundation, the green vines now looking like tattered mourning veils. The front door had been blown off its hinges by the internal pressure of the tunnel collapse. Inside, the smell of burnt paper and ozone was suffocating. Julian led the way to the back room, his flashlight beam dancing over shattered mahogany shelves and heaps of ruined parchment. The secret door behind the bookshelf was jammed, half crushed by a fallen support beam. "Help me," Julian said to Miller. Together, they heaved against the wood until it gave way with a sickening crack. The basement was a tomb. The high-tech monitors were shattered, their screens leaking dark ink. The maglev tunnel entrance had been swallowed by a landslide of wet earth. In the center of the room, slumped over the main console, was the body of Mrs. Gable. She looked peaceful, as if she had simply fallen asleep while cataloguing a particularly dull era of history. In her hand, she clutched a single, leather-bound volume. The History of Blackwood Bay, Volume 1. Julian picked up the book. It wasn't full of text. He flipped through the pages and saw they were all blank, except for the very last one. On it, in Gable's elegant script, was a single sentence. The most effective way to destroy a people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. She was the ultimate gatekeeper, Martha said, standing in the doorway. She didn't just hide the truth. She made sure no one even knew there was a truth to look for. Julian felt a surge of cold fury. He took the brass anchor from his pocket and looked at the ruined console. She missed a chapter, he said. He didn't leave the library empty-handed. He grabbed a small, portable hard drive that had miraculously survived the blast, the backup for Gable's personal logs. If Gable was the archivist, this was her diary. It was the who's who of the Obsidian network. As they emerged from the ruins, the violet sky began to fade into a bruised, metallic gray. The first helicopters were audible in the distance, low, rhythmic thudding that signaled the arrival of the erasers. "Go, Julian," Martha urged. pushing him toward the docks. "Miller will take you as far as the coastal inlets. From there, you're on your own. Don't trust the police. Don't trust the news. Just find Arthur." Julian looked at her one last time. "What about you?" "They'll find you here." "I'm a Wyland," Martha said, her jaw tightening. "I've spent 40 years playing their game. I think it's time I showed them how it ends. I'll keep Holloway busy while you get the word out. Just promise me one thing, Julian." "Anything." "Write it," she said. "Write it all. Don't leave out the fog. Don't leave out the roses. Let the world know that for one night, the people of Blackwood Bay were the only ones who saw the sun." The trip across the bay on the Wanderer was a journey through a nightmare. The water was erratic, swirling in strange, oily patterns where the ferrofluid was still settling into the deep trenches. Miller pushed the boat to its limit, the engine screaming in protest as they dodged floating debris and the occasional dead deep-sea creature that had been coughed up by the pressure vents. "Look," Miller said, pointing back toward the village. Through the morning mist, Julian saw the black SUVs of the Department of Energy swarming the cliffs like beetles. They were already setting up tents and perimeter fences. From this distance, Blackwood Bay looked like it was being quarantined. The violet sky had left behind a shimmering, iridescent residue on the houses, a stain that would likely never wash away. "They'll call it a chemical spill," Miller predicted, "or a freak atmospheric event. By noon, the internet will be scrubbed of every photo taken last night. People will start to doubt their own eyes." "Not this time," Julian said, clutching the brass anchor. "The data on here is encrypted with a recursive key Gable designed. Even their best hackers will take months to crack it. But Arthur Wyland has the original cipher." Martha made sure of that. As they reached a secluded cove 10 miles down the coast, Miller cut the engine. He handed Julian a rucksack containing dry clothes, a burner phone, and a thick wad of cash. "This is as far as I go, lad," Miller said. "I have to get back and sink the boat. Can't have them tracing the trail back to the harbor." "You're going back?" Julian was stunned. "They'll arrest you." "Let them try." Miller grinned, though there was no humor in it. "I've spent my whole life on that water. I know every cave and crawl space in those cliffs. Besides, someone has to make sure Martha doesn't do anything too heroic." Julian stepped onto the sandy shore, the weight of the mission pressing into his chest. He watched as Miller turned the Wanderer back toward the village. The boat looked small and fragile against the vast, grey horizon. He turned and began to hike toward the highway. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a news alert. "Massive earthquake shakes main coast. State of emergency declared." He scrolled down. There were no pictures of the violet sky. There were no mentions of the lighthouse. Just a stock photo of a cracked road and a quote from Agent Holloway about infrastructure stability. The erasure had begun, but as Julian reached the road and saw the lights of a passing truck, he felt a strange sense of calm. He wasn't the victim of the story anymore. He was the narrator, and the narrator always gets the last word. 3 months later, the world was a different place, though most people didn't know why. The Great Earthquake of 2026 was a fading memory for the general public. But in the scientific community, the Blackwood anomalies were the subject of heated, whispered debates. The tides had shifted by 3 inches globally. The weather patterns were becoming more volatile, more unpredictable. Julian Thorne sat in a high-rise office in Manhattan, looking out at the skyline. Across from him sat Arthur Wyland. Arthur was the mirror image of Henry, but his eyes were filled with a quiet, scholarly kindness instead of cold ambition. "My brother always was obsessed with the idea of a perfect world," Arthur said, tapping the brass anchor on his desk. He didn't realize that perfection is a form of death. Change is the only thing that proves we're alive. Did we stop them? Julian asked. The red dots on the map, are they really gone? The grid is dead, Julian. Arthur confirmed. The feedback loop Martha triggered burned out the harvesting arrays in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. The obsidian network has lost its teeth. They're still out there, of course. Men like that don't just disappear. But they're hiding in the shadows again. They're no longer the architects of the future. And Martha? Arthur's face clouded. She's safe. For now. She's living under an assumed name in a small town in the Alps. She doesn't garden anymore. She says the soil feels too quiet. Julian looked at the laptop in front of him. On the screen was a document that was nearly 800 pages long. It contained every log, every technical spec, and every name he had pulled from Gable's archive and Martha's journals. It was the truth, unvarnished and terrifying. If you publish this, Julian, your life as you knew it is over. Arthur warned. You'll be a target for the rest of your days. There are a lot of people who would prefer the chemical spill narrative. I know. Julian said. He thought about the red roses in Martha's garden. He thought about the look on Miller's face as he sailed back into the violet dawn. He thought about the weight of the silver dust and the silence of the library. He reached out and hit the enter key. The upload began. The data was being sent to a dozen independent news outlets, 3 international investigative bodies, and a public server that couldn't be shut down. I'm a writer, Arthur. Julian said, standing up and grabbing his coat. And a writer's only job is to make sure the story doesn't end in the dark. A year had passed since the night the sky turned violet. Julian Thorne walked down the familiar gravel path toward the small white house on the hill. He looked different now. His hair was graying at the temples, and his eyes had the watchful, alert quality of a man who never sat with his back to a door. The village of Blackwood Bay was quiet. The Department of Energy had long since left, leaving behind a series of monitoring stations that were mostly empty. The tourists were gone, scared off by the rumors of radiation and ghost lights. The town had returned to what it was before the project, a cluster of stone houses at the edge of the world. He reached the wooden fence and stopped. Martha's garden was no longer full of red roses. The synthetic soil had been replaced by wild, local seagrass and hardy coastal wildflowers. The grey stone house was occupied by a young family who had no idea who Martha Wyland was. They just liked the view of the ocean. Julian walked to his own front door. He didn't live here anymore. The house was a museum of his former life. But he came back once a month to check on the mail and the air. He went to his desk. The old typewriter was gone, replaced by a sleek laptop. Beside it sat a copy of his book. It hadn't been a bestseller. It had been banned in 7 countries and fact-checked into oblivion by the mainstream press. But it was there. People were reading it in secret. They were looking at the sky and asking questions. He looked out the window. The ocean was a deep, restless blue. The fog was rolling in. But it wasn't the thick, heavy wall of the past. It was a natural mist, thin and translucent, carrying the scent of salt and ancient depths. A man was standing on the beach below the cliffs. He was wearing a heavy navy blue sweater and a captain's hat. He was looking out at the horizon, his hands tucked into his pockets. Julian waved, and the man, Miller, raised a hand in a slow, steady salute before turning back to the water. Julian sat down and opened a new file on his computer. He looked at the white screen for a long time. The story of the Obsidian Network was over. But the story of the world was just beginning. The energy he had vented was still there, shifting the world in ways they were only starting to understand. It was a new era, a violet era. He began to type. The fog has lifted, but the world is not as clear as we hoped. We have traded a beautiful lie for a difficult truth. But as I look out over the bay, I realize that the truth is like the tide. You can try to build walls against it. You can try to hide it in archives, but eventually, it always comes home. He stopped and looked at a small, green gardening glove sitting on the corner of his desk. He smiled, a touch of his old wit returning. And in the end, even in the coldest ground, something always manages to grow. Julian Thorne closed his laptop. He walked out onto the porch, took a deep breath of the salt air, and watched the sun set over Blackwood Bay. The sky wasn't violet anymore, but as the first star appeared, it sparkled with a brilliance that seemed just a little bit brighter than before.